We are handing over the entire $2 billion to Brent, my father announced, his voice echoing coldly and deliberately off the glass walls of the executive boardroom. And as for you, pack your things. You are fired, effective immediately. I stared at him, the air completely leaving my lungs as the full weight of the betrayal settled over me like a suffocating fog. So you just sold my code? I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the unbearably tense room. My mother chuckled softly, smoothing her expensive designer skirt with a dismissive, practiced wave of her hand. We sold our business, Gemma. Stop being so delusional and learn to accept reality. The buyer, Donovan, the CEO of the massive pharmaceutical company that had just written the enormous check, suddenly stood up from his leather chair. He was beginning to look visibly uncomfortable with the deeply dysfunctional family dynamic playing out right in front of him. But my father swiftly cut him off, signaling the security guards waiting silently by the heavy doors. My name is Gemma. I am 33 years old. And until that precise moment, I was the lead computational biologist at my family firm. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your hard work stolen by the very people who were supposed to protect you. The two burly security guards stepped forward immediately at my father Richard's cold command. They did not even give me a single moment to process what was actually happening. One of them grabbed my left arm while the other stood uncomfortably close to my right side, treating me like a corporate spy rather than the founding scientist of the entire company. I shrugged them both off firmly, maintaining every shred of my dignity as I walked out of the glass boardroom with my head held high. The silence in the hallway was absolutely deafening. Dozens of employees, people I had personally trained and worked countless late nights alongside, suddenly found their shoes incredibly fascinating. No one dared to make eye contact with me. Brent, my older brother by 2 years, followed closely behind me with a smug, triumphant grin plastered across his face. He was wearing a custom Italian suit that cost more than my very first car, paid for entirely by the company funds I had generated through years of relentless research. He clapped his hands together sharply, a mocking sound that ricocheted through the open plan office like a gunshot. "Let us get moving, genius," he sneered with visible satisfaction. "We have a massive company to hand over to Donovan today, and you are currently trespassing on Horizon Pharma property." I reached my small office. It was not even a corner suite. Despite creating the core artificial intelligence algorithm that predicted genetic mutations, the very algorithm that had just sold for $2 billion, my parents had always insisted I remain in a modest, unremarkable workspace. They constantly claimed the corner offices were reserved exclusively for client-facing executives like Brent. Now, a cheap cardboard box sat squarely on my desk, already waiting for me like a coffin. My mother, Patricia, strolled into the room right behind Brent. She looked immaculate and entirely untouched by guilt, her hair perfectly blown out, expensive diamonds resting elegantly at her throat. She leaned against the doorframe with the casual authority of someone watching a minor inconvenience resolve itself, observing me with an expression of pure, unfiltered disdain. "Do not take all day, Gemma," she snapped, her voice carrying that particular sharpness she reserved for staff she considered beneath her. "We have a celebration dinner booked at a Michelin star restaurant tonight, and we absolutely cannot be late simply because you are dragging your feet." I picked up a framed photograph of my dog and placed it carefully into the box. "You are really doing this," I said, keeping my voice remarkably steady despite the violent storm raging deep inside my chest. After 7 long years. 7 years I spent down in the windowless basement of our old house writing that entire biological code from absolute scratch. I built the predictive models while you two vacationed leisurely across Europe. I debugged the neural networks on weekends while Brent was out destroying company golf carts and expensing $1,000 bottles of champagne directly to the corporate account. Brent laughed out loud with genuine amusement. He walked right up to my desk, snatched the employee identification badge clean off my lanyard, and dropped it straight into the trash can with deliberate theatrical flair. "You always were a dramatic little nerd," he said, leaning over my desk with practiced condescension. "That is exactly why Mom and Dad run the business side and you just push buttons on a keyboard. You seriously thought you owned any of this? You were just an employee, Gemma, an overpaid one at that." I looked at my mother, desperately searching her face for a shred of maternal instinct, a flicker of guilt, or genuine remorse. There was absolutely nothing there. She simply checked her expensive watch with a bored, impatient expression. "You were given a wonderful opportunity to work for the family," Patricia said smoothly, as though reciting a script she had rehearsed many times. "But you always had this arrogant streak running through you. You thought that because you typed up some math equations, you were suddenly the boss of us all. Your father and I took all the real financial risks. We built this brand from nothing. Brent managed the critical client relationships. You were just the hired help who got a little too big for her boots." The sheer audacity of her words was staggering and almost incomprehensible. They had taken zero financial risks. I had used my own meager personal savings to purchase the initial computer servers. I had worked completely unpaid for the first 3 years while they systematically drained the company accounts to fund their extravagant Silicon Valley lifestyle. Brent had not managed a single meaningful client relationship in his life. He simply showed up to the final meetings to shake hands and take credit for the polished technical presentations I had meticulously prepared for him every single time, without exception. "So, $2 billion, I said quietly, placing my favorite coffee mug into the cardboard box. "And you are giving it all to the golden child who failed basic biology in college." "He is the vice president of sales," my mother corrected sharply, her voice deliberately projecting down the hallway for the remaining staff to absorb. "He is the face of this enterprise. He is a natural leader. You, on the other hand, have always lacked social grace and fundamental business acumen. We are simply correcting a wrong today. We are ensuring the wealth flows to the child who actually knows how to carry the family legacy forward into the future. You should honestly be thanking us for keeping you employed this long, considering your constant mental instability." Mental instability. That was the precise toxic phrase they always deployed to gaslight me whenever I dared to demand equity or fair compensation. If I asked for my rightful shares, I was acting crazy. If I complained about working relentless 90-hour weeks while Brent jetted off on luxurious ski trips, I was being hysterical. They had systematically and deliberately isolated me, ensuring I poured every last ounce of my energy and creativity into the code, while they quietly and methodically controlled the entire corporate structure from behind the curtain. I closed the flaps of the cardboard box with a calm, measured finality. The security guards stepped closer, positioning themselves to physically escort me from the building. I looked at Brent, who was already admiring his own reflection in the glass of my office window, no doubt mentally furnishing the oceanfront mansion he planned to purchase by the weekend. Then I looked at my mother, who glared at me as though I were a persistent pest that had finally been exterminated from her otherwise perfect, curated life. I did not scream. I did not cry or beg for my job back. I simply picked up the box. "Enjoy your dinner," I said evenly, walking right past them both. As I rode the elevator down to the main lobby, flanked by the silent, expressionless guards, I realized I did not even have my company car keys anymore. They had demanded them back the previous day under the transparent guise of a routine fleet inventory check. They had planned this ambush with cold, deliberate precision. I stepped out into the damp California air, carrying my entire professional life in a cardboard box, completely stripped of my life's work, my financial security, and my family. But as I began the long, solitary walk to the train station, a strange and powerful sense of clarity washed over me like cold water. They thought they had won. They thought they had secured a $2 billion fortune and successfully disposed of the only person who truly understood how the machinery worked. They had absolutely no idea what they had just unleashed. The public transit system of the Bay Area had never felt so painfully slow. I sat on the hard, unforgiving plastic seat of the train, with the cardboard box resting heavily on my lap. The sharp edges of the box dug insistently into my thighs, serving as a constant physical reminder of the humiliation I had just been forced to endure. Across from me, two young men in branded tech company fleece vests were loudly and enthusiastically discussing their latest seed funding round and startup valuations. Their arrogant, booming laughter echoed throughout the train car, sounding uncomfortably like my brother Brent. I stared blankly out the window as the sprawling, gleaming tech campuses of Silicon Valley blurred past in the fading afternoon light. Just an hour ago, I was the unseen architect of a $2 billion empire. Now I was just another unemployed commuter clutching a box of desk trinkets on a crowded train. I kept my breathing perfectly even and controlled. I absolutely refused to let the shock paralyze me. Panic was a useless emotion, an inefficient variable that I had always methodically removed from my biological algorithms. My parents and my brother had meticulously orchestrated my removal. They had legally locked me out of the building, confiscated my company vehicle, and stripped away my daily routine in a matter of minutes. But there was one thing they could not strip from me: my intellect. I simply needed to recalibrate my entire life strategy. I needed a secure environment in which to process the full, staggering magnitude of their theft. And most importantly, I needed my partner. My thoughts turned immediately to Lance. We had been engaged for exactly 8 months. Lance was a senior portfolio manager at a highly aggressive investment firm in the financial district. He was brilliant with numbers, absolutely ruthless with contracts, and understood the vicious mechanics of corporate warfare better than almost anyone I had ever met. When I first told him about the artificial intelligence code I was developing for the family business, he was the one who passionately encouraged me to work late into the night. He always said we were building a foundation for our future together. He would rub my tired shoulders when I dragged myself home exhausted at 2 in the morning, whispering promises that the eventual payout would make every dark circle under my eyes completely worth the sacrifice. I pictured his face clearly as the train screeched to a jarring halt at my station. Lance would be absolutely furious on my behalf. He would immediately drop whatever financial portfolio he was analyzing. He would pour 2 generous glasses of the expensive red wine we kept saved for meaningful occasions. Then he would settle at our kitchen island, open his laptop with focused determination, and begin drafting a ruthless, methodical counterattack. He knew corporate lawyers. He understood how to identify and leverage financial discrepancies with surgical precision. He would be my ultimate anchor in this sudden, devastating storm. The mere thought of his steady, supportive presence gave me the strength to carry the heavy box the remaining 6 blocks to our luxury apartment building. The doorman greeted me with his usual polite nod, though his eyes flickered curiously and briefly to the cardboard box in my arms. I offered a tight, forced smile and stepped into the elevator. As the illuminated floor numbers climbed steadily toward our penthouse level, I glanced down at my left hand. The diamond engagement ring caught and scattered the harsh overhead light. It was a flawless stone, a tangible symbol of the stable, predictable future I had believed was securely mine. I took a long, steadying breath as the elevator doors slid open. I walked down the carpeted hallway in silence, rehearsing carefully the words I would use to break the news. I did not want to sound hysterical or scattered. I wanted to present the facts with clarity and precision so we could immediately transition into problem-solving mode together. I pushed my key into the lock and turned the handle. I stepped inside, expecting the familiar, pristine order of our shared living space. Lance was notoriously fastidious about neatness, insisting on a perfectly organized home environment to reflect his structured financial mindset. But the scene that greeted me made my feet freeze completely on the hardwood floor. The apartment was in a state of absolute, bewildering chaos. The closet doors down the hallway had been thrown wide open. Expensive tailored shirts, silk ties, and dry cleaning bags were scattered haphazardly across the custom velvet sofa in the living room. The drawers of the entryway console table had been yanked out and left hanging open, their contents rummaged through carelessly. For one brief, terrifying moment, my analytical mind registered a home invasion. I nearly dropped the box to call the police, but then I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of purposeful footsteps coming from our master bedroom. I walked slowly into the living room, the cardboard box suddenly feeling 100 times heavier in my arms. Right at the center of our expensive Persian rug sat an enormous piece of rigid leather luggage. Lance was forcefully cramming his designer shoes and neatly folded suits into the massive travel suitcase with cold efficiency. His golf clubs were already propped by the front door alongside a carefully arranged stack of his personal financial documents. He was not packing for a weekend business trip. He was evacuating completely. "Lance," I said, my voice slicing cleanly through the charged silence of the apartment. He startled slightly, his broad shoulders tensing visibly beneath his crisp dress shirt. He spun around to face me. He did not look like a man relieved or happy to see his future wife. He did not rush forward to take the heavy box from my aching arms. His eyes moved quickly from my face down to the cardboard box, registering the framed photo and scattered office supplies protruding from the top. A dark, calculating expression washed over his handsome features, the precise same cold, predatory look he wore when shorting a failing stock on the trading floor. There was absolutely no warmth left in the room. The comforting embrace I had desperately needed evaporated entirely into the cool, sterile air. He straightened up slowly, brushing a non-existent piece of lint from his trousers with exaggerated composure. He did not ask if I was all right. He did not ask why I was standing in our home in the middle of the afternoon holding a box of desk belongings. He simply stared at me with an unsettling, practiced calmness that made my blood run instantly cold. The chaotic disorder scattered across the living room suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. The betrayal was not confined to the glass walls of my family boardroom. It had followed me all the way home and was waiting patiently in the very center of what I had believed was my sanctuary. I set the heavy cardboard box down onto the cool marble surface of our kitchen island. The dull, hollow thud echoed through the tense space between us. Lance did not flinch. He offered no word of comfort or acknowledgement. Instead, he reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and produced a small velvet box. He placed it with deliberate precision on the counter directly beside the framed photograph of my dog. He flipped the lid open with a single practiced motion. My engagement ring sat inside, catching the overhead light and throwing tiny prisms across the ceiling, mocking, it seemed, my entire existence. "Brent called me," Lance said. His voice was completely stripped of warmth or humanity. It carried the same detached clinical tone he used when liquidating a dead corporate asset on the trading floor. "He told me everything. $2 billion, Gemma. The company sold for $2 billion. And you walked away with absolutely zero equity. You let them play you like a complete amateur." I stared at the sparkling ring for a long moment, then slowly raised my eyes to meet those of the man I had planned to spend my life with. "They stole my code, Lance. My own parents physically removed me from the building to hand the entire fortune to Brent. I thought you would understand." I genuinely believed we would fight them in court together. Lance let out a short, harsh, humorless laugh. He zipped up his massive leather duffel bag with a sharp, decisive pull. Fight them with what exactly? You have no money, you have no job. You don't even have a basic severance package to show for 7 years of work. I am a portfolio manager, Gemma. I calculate risk and return for a living. And right now, you are the single biggest financial liability in all of Silicon Valley. His words landed with force, but they did not break me. My analytical mind quietly cataloged the information, updating its model of his true character with cold efficiency. He had never loved me as a person. He had loved only my proximity to a massive, inevitable tech buyout. Brent made me a very attractive offer, Lance continued, grabbing his heavy platinum watch from the side table and clasping it firmly onto his wrist. He needs someone genuinely competent to manage the transition of the sale funds. He offered me the chief financial officer position. 7 figures, exclusive stock options in his new holding company, and a substantial signing bonus. And the only condition, I replied, my voice dropping to a glacial, measured chill, was that you drop the dead weight. Lance smirked, straightening his collar in the hallway mirror with the casual vanity of someone who had already made peace with the decision. Brent is a complete idiot, but he has the capital now. I go where the money flows. That has always been the only real logic in this business. You should have been smarter, Gemma. You spent 7 years writing a genuinely brilliant biological algorithm in a basement, but you never once learned how to actually secure what you built in the real world. You are penniless. I cannot build a future with a woman who allows her own family to strip her of her life's work without a single legal safeguard in place. You are a failure. He grabbed the sturdy handle of his suitcase. The wheels rolled smoothly and quietly across the expensive Persian rug. He hoisted his golf bag onto his shoulder with practiced ease and looked at me one final time, his gaze sweeping critically and dismissively over my simple clothes and the sad cardboard box sitting on the counter. Good luck figuring out your next move. You are genuinely going to need it. I did not shed a single tear. My heart rate remained perfectly, deliberately steady. The initial shock had fully evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus that sharpened everything around me into vivid clarity. My mind had already completely detached from the man standing across the room. He was no longer my partner. He was simply another hostile variable that required immediate neutralization. I walked to the far end of the kitchen counter where my personal laptop rested. I lifted the screen. The blue glow illuminated my face as my fingers moved rapidly and surely across the keyboard. I executed a precise sequence of commands, accessing a highly encrypted financial portal I had quietly established months earlier for my private business operations. Lance paused at the front door, his hand resting on the brass handle. He looked back over his shoulder, clearly expecting to find me in tears, begging him to reconsider, or collapsing entirely under the weight of the day. Instead, I pressed the enter key with a clean, satisfying click. "Drive safe, Lance," I said, keeping my gaze locked on the bright screen. "Though you might want to arrange a cab first. That brand new Porsche Brent promised you as a signing bonus? It is about to become a significant problem. He told you he was handling the down payment this morning, didn't he?" Lance narrowed his eyes, his grip tightening reflexively on his luggage. "What exactly are you talking about?" I turned my head slowly to meet his stare. A cold, precise smile spread across my lips. "Brent has terrible credit. For years, he has been secretly funneling money through a corporate account to sustain his lifestyle. But that particular corporate account is tied directly to a limited liability company that I personally registered and still legally control. I just reported the card stolen and flagged the dealership transaction as fraudulent." Lance went completely pale, His arrogant, assured posture crumbled in a single instant. The dealership is repossessing the vehicle as we speak, I concluded, my voice dropping to a perfectly even whisper. Enjoy the walk. The morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my apartment in sharp, unforgiving angles. I had not slept a single minute. Instead, I had spent the entire night meticulously working through the merger and acquisition documents between my family's business and Horizon Pharma, cross-referencing legal filings, corporate registrations, and financial structures with the focused intensity of someone dismantling a bomb. I needed coffee before contacting my legal counsel. I walked down to the upscale espresso bar on the ground floor of my building. The barista, a young man who knew my usual order by heart, handed me my black coffee. I tapped my primary platinum debit card against the payment terminal. A harsh, electronic beep broke the quiet morning. Declined. The barista frowned apologetically, wiped the terminal screen, and asked me to try again. I tapped the card a second time. Another sharp beep. Declined. I reached for my backup credit card. A corporate account I had personally guaranteed. Declined. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Not panic. Pure, calculated realization. I stepped aside to let the customer behind me proceed, and pulled out my smartphone with deliberate calm. I opened my private banking application. The loading screen spun for an unusually long interval. When the dashboard finally appeared, a large red banner glared back at me across the interface. Account frozen. Please contact your branch manager immediately regarding an active court order. I stepped out onto the busy San Francisco sidewalk. The sharp morning air hit my face as I dialed the direct line to my wealth manager. He answered on the first ring, his voice trembling with an uneasy combination of professional courtesy and barely concealed panic. Gemma, he began immediately. I am deeply sorry. Our legal compliance department received an emergency injunction at exactly 6 o'clock this morning. We had absolutely no choice but to comply with a temporary asset freeze across all your personal and business accounts. I kept my voice completely level. On what grounds did a judge sign off on an emergency injunction without notifying me first? He swallowed audibly. Your father, acting in his capacity as chief executive officer of the company, filed an expedited corporate espionage claim late last night. The legal filing alleges that you removed highly sensitive proprietary company property from the premises. They are claiming that the cardboard box you carried out contained encrypted hard drives loaded with the $2 billion artificial intelligence algorithm. The judge granted a temporary asset freeze to prevent you from leaving the jurisdiction or transferring allegedly stolen data to foreign competitors. The breathtaking audacity of the fabrication was almost impressive. Richard had weaponized the legal system against his own daughter in the span of a single night. He knew perfectly well there were no hard drives in that box. He had security footage of my every move. This was not a legitimate legal strategy. It was a siege tactic, methodical, surgical, and designed specifically to starve me of resources before I could mount any meaningful response. Thank you for the update, I told my wealth manager with professional composure. Do not process any further requests from my family without my explicit verbal authorization. I ended the call and slipped the phone into my pocket. It vibrated almost immediately. The caller ID displayed my father's name. I let it ring 3 deliberate times, controlling the rhythm of the interaction, before pressing the green button and lifting the phone calmly to my ear. Good morning, Gemma, Richard said. His voice was smooth and dripping with the manufactured paternal warmth he reserved exclusively for moments when he was about to destroy someone. I assume you have already tried to buy your morning coffee by now? I stared at the busy intersection ahead of me, watching the traffic move with mathematical regularity. You filed a fraudulent claim with a federal judge, I stated with flat precision. You and I both know that box contained nothing but a framed photograph and a coffee mug. Perjury is an extremely dangerous game to be playing in the middle of a $2 billion corporate transaction. My father laughed, a dark, self-satisfied rumble that made my skin prickle. Prove it, he said, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once faced real consequences. We have the finest corporate lawyers in the state on retainer. You currently have $0 and zero standing to hire a defense attorney. We can keep this alive in civil court for years. We will bleed you completely dry. I said nothing. I allowed his threats to hang in the open air between us. My silence always unsettled him. It meant I was studying him, running the data, and he despised being analyzed. Listen to me very carefully, Richard continued, his tone shifting from smug to openly commanding. Your mother and I are willing to be reasonable about this. We understand you had a difficult emotional reaction yesterday because you felt excluded from the financial outcome. We are prepared to drop the lawsuit and unfreeze your accounts. But you will need to demonstrate that you have earned your way back into this family. I leaned with controlled calm against the brick wall of my building. And what exactly does earning my way back entail? A long, theatrical sigh came through the receiver. You need to demonstrate basic respect. We are hosting a private celebration this evening at the estate. The top tier of Silicon Valley will be present. Investors, developers, board members of Horizon Pharma. I want you to walk through those front doors. I want you to stand before me, your mother, and your brother in front of our guests. Lower yourself to your knees and publicly apologize for your insubordination. You will acknowledge that your erratic and unstable behavior was the cause of your termination. If you can humble yourself convincingly and show genuine remorse, I will transfer $50,000 into your account tomorrow morning so you can begin rebuilding your life elsewhere. He wanted a public spectacle, a permanent witnessed humiliation to cement their narrative that I had been nothing more than an unstable, ungrateful employee who contributed nothing of lasting value. $50,000. An insulting, calculated crumb designed to purchase my permanent silence while they walked away with billions. They believed they had cornered me with no possible exit. They assumed my entire survival depended on the funds they had just frozen. But my parents had made one catastrophic miscalculation in designing their strategy. They had assumed I was as careless and reckless with my assets as Brent had always been with his. They had assumed the money they froze represented my only financial lifeline. I will not be attending any apologies, Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a precise and dangerous register. You are making a catastrophic mistake, he growled, the thin mask of the concerned father disappearing instantly. You have until tonight. If you do not appear at that estate on your knees, I will ensure you never work in the biotechnology sector again. I will personally see to it that every door in this industry is permanently closed to you. I will crush you completely. I ended the call without another word. The threat was empty noise, the blustering of a man who had not yet realized he had made the worst business decision of his life. I did not need his money to get through the week. I did not need his permission or his connections to rebuild in this industry. I needed only two things: my intellect and my legal counsel. I raised my hand and hailed a passing taxi, paying the driver with a crisp $100 bill I kept folded carefully inside the lining of my coat for emergencies, precisely like this one. The downtown legal district, I instructed, settling into the back seat. As quickly as possible. I had a meeting to arrange with Sylvia, the most relentlessly effective intellectual property attorney on the entire West Coast. The financial blockade was a minor inconvenience, and a temporary one at that. The real war was only just beginning. I spent the entire afternoon inside the secured conference room of Sylvia's firm. Together we mapped every viable legal contingency with exhaustive precision and reinforced the hidden corporate structures I had quietly established and maintained over the preceding years. By the time I returned to my apartment building as the sun began to set, a courier had deposited a heavy gold-embossed envelope with the concierge downstairs. It was a formal invitation to the $2 billion victory gala being held that evening at my parents' private estate in Atherton. Patricia was not extending any olive branch. She was summoning me to witness my own public execution and ensuring the entire technology industry had a front-row seat to watch me arrive broken and defeated. Since Richard had successfully frozen my accounts and stripped me of my company vehicle, hiring a premium car service was entirely out of the question. I refused to touch my carefully protected emergency reserves for something so trivial. Instead, I put on my sharpest black dress, stepped into a pair of impeccable heels, and took the commuter train as far as the line would carry me. From the station, I walked the remaining 2 miles up the steep, winding roads of that exclusive neighborhood in the cooling evening air. Luxury sedans, sleek black town cars, and polished sports cars swept past me continuously in the fading light. I held my posture perfectly straight and kept my breathing deeply controlled. The physical effort sharpened my thinking with every step. By the time I reached the massive wrought iron gates of my childhood home, I was not exhausted. I was energized, alert, and entirely ready for what came next. The mansion had been completely transformed for the occasion. Valets in crisp white uniforms moved efficiently across the circular driveway, parking an unending stream of expensive vehicles. String musicians performed a sophisticated arrangement on the immaculately maintained front lawn, and the entire property was bathed in warm, dramatic theatrical lighting. Servers moved through the gathering with silver trays carrying vintage champagne and imported caviar. This was not merely a celebration of a corporate transaction. It was a royal coronation, specifically designed for my brother Brent. I bypassed the crowded main entrance entirely and slipped confidently through the side terrace doors. The grand ballroom was filled with the most powerful and influential figures in Silicon Valley. I recognized venture capitalists whose names appeared on the covers of industry magazines, prominent technology journalists, board members from competing firms, and multiple senior executives from Horizon Pharma. These were precisely the people who controlled the movement of capital, professional reputation, and opportunity across the entire biotechnology sector. My parents had assembled the perfect audience to permanently and publicly end my career. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and positioned myself near a towering floral arrangement, quietly reading the room with the careful attention I brought to every complex problem. It took very little time to identify the coordinated whisper campaign already in motion. As I moved slowly and deliberately through the crowd, conversations halted mid-sentence. Executives who had praised my genetic research enthusiastically just weeks ago suddenly discovered urgent reasons to turn away. The social freeze was complete, absolute, and unmistakably orchestrated. I traced the source of the poisonous current directly to my mother. Patricia was holding court near the grand marble fireplace, positioned at the precise center of a cluster of key investors, and Donovan, the chief executive of Horizon Pharma. She wore a breathtaking emerald gown and carried an expression of deeply practiced, entirely fabricated maternal grief. I moved closer, remaining just beyond the edge of her peripheral vision, and listened carefully to the careful, calculated poison she was methodically injecting into my professional network. "It has been an incredibly difficult year for the entire family," Patricia sighed, pressing a perfectly manicured hand with practiced elegance to her chest. "We tried absolutely everything within our power to help Gemma. We paid for the finest therapists money could find, gave her unlimited time away from the office, but her mental state simply continued to deteriorate despite every intervention. The pressure of the biotechnology sector is unfortunately too much for certain fragile minds to sustain." Donovan looked genuinely and visibly troubled by this revelation. I had no idea whatsoever that she was dealing with clinical psychiatric issues. Her data models during the initial pitch were always so extraordinarily precise and genuinely groundbreaking. Patricia shook her head with slow, sorrowful regret, dabbing at a tear that did not exist. The models were largely Brent's conceptual work, of course. Gemma simply handled the routine data entry and basic coding support. Unfortunately, her delusions escalated completely beyond our ability to manage. She began genuinely believing she had invented the algorithm entirely on her own and that she personally owned the company. We had to let her go for her own protection and for the safety of this merger. We are sincerely hoping that this necessary financial separation finally motivates her to seek the professional psychiatric help she has been desperately avoiding. The flawless, rehearsed delivery of the lie was breathtaking in its precision. She was systematically dismantling my professional credibility in real time, rebranding me as an unstable, delusional data entry clerk in front of the most powerful figures in the industry. In Silicon Valley, being publicly labeled a psychiatric liability was an absolute and total career death sentence, the kind of reputation that followed you permanently and closed every door before you could reach it. I stepped out calmly from behind the towering floral arrangement and walked with measured, deliberate strides directly into the center of their exclusive circle. The temperature of the group dropped instantly and perceptibly. Patricia froze mid-movement, her champagne glass hovering an inch from her lips. "Good evening, Mother," I said. My voice was perfectly modulated, entirely composed, and carrying just enough volume to turn heads across the surrounding room. "I apologize for missing the opening act of your creative storytelling. I had to walk the entire distance here, as Father illegally seized my vehicle this morning under demonstrably false pretenses." The investors shifted noticeably, exchanging uncertain, uncomfortable glances. Donovan looked completely bewildered by the sudden charged tension radiating through the group. Patricia recovered with impressive speed, sliding seamlessly into her performance of concerned maternal distress. "Gemma, sweetheart, you really should not be here tonight. You are clearly experiencing another acute episode. We can arrange for a doctor to come to you right now and get you the help you need." I smiled, a sharp, clean expression that made her flinch visibly despite herself. "I am in perfect health, Patricia. My cognitive functions are operating at full and maximum capacity. I am simply here to personally congratulate Donovan on the purchase of an extraordinarily expensive shell company." Donovan's expression shifted, stepping forward with immediate and focused curiosity. "What exactly do you mean by a shell company?" Patricia let out a sharp, high-pitched laugh and reached out to grasp Donovan's arm with barely concealed desperation. "Please do not listen to her, Donovan. I told you she suffers from these paranoid delusions. Security will have her escorted from the premises immediately." I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact with the chief executive of Horizon Pharma for even a fraction of a second. I simply looked at him with the steady, unwavering certainty of someone who already knows precisely how the next chapter ends. A wise investor always verifies the integrity of the source code before clearing a $2 billion payment, I said calmly. "Donovan, I would strongly suggest having your technical team run a comprehensive deep diagnostic on the primary servers first thing tomorrow morning. You may find the underlying architecture somewhat lacking without the presence of its original architect." Donovan narrowed his eyes, visibly and genuinely unsettled by the directness and specificity of my challenge. Before he could formulate a follow-up question about the source code, a heavy, aggressively firm hand clamped down hard on my left shoulder. The overwhelming combination of commercial designer cologne and expensive vintage wine hit my senses a fraction of a second before I heard his voice. "Gemma, there you are," Brent announced, projecting with polished, theatrical confidence across the immediate cluster of venture capitalists. "We have been looking absolutely everywhere for you." His fingers dug with deliberate, painful precision into my collarbone, a clear physical threat concealed beneath the performance of warm brotherly affection. He stepped smoothly and decisively between Donovan and me, using the full width of his broad shoulders to physically cut off my access to the pharmaceutical executive. Brent flashed his signature empty, practiced smile at the visibly bewildered CEO. "You will have to excuse us, Donovan," Brent said with a smooth, apologetic laugh. "My little sister unfortunately forgot to take her medication today. Purely a family matter. I am sure you completely understand. I will have security ensure she gets home safely." I did not resist his grip. Struggling against him physically in the center of a corporate gala would serve only to confirm every fabricated detail of their meticulously constructed narrative. I allowed him to steer me away from the heart of the room, using the time to observe his elevated heart rate and the faint but unmistakable sheen of sweat beginning to form at his temples. He was frightened. My mere, unexpected presence had fractured the surface of their flawless victory celebration, and he was working with visible desperation to contain the breach. Brent guided me firmly toward the shadowed far edge of the grand ballroom, positioning us beside a towering and elaborate ice sculpture carved in the shape of the company logo. We were no longer within easy earshot of the primary investors, but we remained fully visible to the surrounding room. He released my shoulder and immediately snatched a large crystal goblet brimming with dark red Cabernet from a passing server's silver tray. "You genuinely do not know when to quit, do you?" Brent hissed through clenched teeth, dropping the performance the instant our backs were turned to the crowd. His eyes were wide with a manic, barely contained energy that betrayed the fear underneath. "You could not simply sit in your miserable little apartment and absorb a defeat gracefully. You had to drag yourself up this entire hill in the dark just to ruin my evening." I regarded him with complete clinical detachment. "I did not ruin anything, Brent. I offered Donovan a straightforward piece of standard technical advice. If your product performs exactly the way you guaranteed him it would, you have absolutely nothing whatsoever to be concerned about." A muscle in his jaw twitched violently. He took a long, greedy swallow of the wine, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly. "The product works perfectly fine," he spat back with forced conviction. "And it belongs entirely to me now. To the family. You spent 7 solid years walking around acting as though you were some kind of irreplaceable genius, but you are nothing. You are a socially awkward, thoroughly unlikable data cruncher who got fortunate with a few clever lines of mathematics. I am the one who sold this vision to the world. I am the one who charmed the board members and built the critical relationships. I am the one walking away with $1 billion trust fund to show for it." I held his gaze without blinking. "You could not write a functioning sorting algorithm if your life literally depended on the outcome," I said, stating it as cleanly and factually as a clinical observation. "You are going to burn through every cent of that money before you develop even a rudimentary understanding of how capital gains taxation operates." His face flushed an immediate, deep, angry crimson. The truth had that reliable effect on him. It enraged him precisely because he lacked the intellectual foundation to construct any argument against it. His eyes moved slowly down from my face, locking onto the pristine white designer dress I had selected with complete deliberateness for this specific evening. A dark, vicious realization settled over his features like a shadow. He stepped closer, violating my personal space with calculated menace, tilting the heavy crystal goblet of wine directly above my chest. "Allow me to explain the natural order of things to you, Gemma," he whispered, his voice soaked in absolute contempt. "I am the star of this legacy. I am the face and the future of this empire. You were put on this earth simply to exist as a backdrop for my success. You are nothing but the grease coating the gears of my rise. Remember your place in this family." With a sharp, deliberate flick of his wrist, Brent tipped the crystal goblet forward. A heavy cascade of dark red Cabernet fell like a curtain, striking my collar and splashing violently across the front of my white silk dress. The cold liquid soaked instantly through the expensive fabric, clinging to my skin and spreading in a wide, undeniable crimson stain across my chest. A collective, sharp gasp rippled through the nearest cluster of guests. Surrounding conversations died in an instant as the room turned instinctively toward the disturbance. Brent immediately threw both hands up in theatrical horror, widening his eyes with practiced, dramatic dismay. "Oh my God, Gemma, I am so incredibly sorry," he announced loudly, ensuring his voice reached every corner of the silent ballroom. "My hand just completely slipped. Let me find you a towel immediately. You must be absolutely mortified." He reached toward me with extended hands, performing concern with professional ease. I took a single calm half-step backward, avoiding his touch entirely and without any urgency. I looked down at the ruined silk for a long, quiet moment, feeling the cold wine tracking its slow path down my skin. Then I raised my head deliberately and looked directly into my brother's eyes. I did not scream. I did not dissolve into tears. I did not raise my hand against him. I simply stood there, dripping, wearing his pathetic attempt at humiliation like armor. And I smiled. It was not a performance. It was not strained or forced. It was a genuine, deeply unhurried expression of absolute certainty, the smile of an apex predator watching a mouse that has just enthusiastically and irreversibly walked into a steel trap. Brent's rehearsed apology faltered mid-sentence. The smug, triumphant satisfaction drained completely from his face, replaced by a sudden, chilling confusion that he could not hide. He took a half-step backward, profoundly unsettled by my total and complete absence of distress or shame. He had fully expected me to shatter in front of the room. Instead, I was radiating something cold, untouchable, and infinitely more dangerous than anger. I turned my back on him without another word or glance. The assembled Silicon Valley elite instinctively parted around me, creating a wide and open path to the exit as though by some collective, unspoken agreement. No one whispered. No one moved. Patricia suddenly broke free from her cluster of admirers near the fireplace, rushing forward with a linen napkin clutched in her hand, resuming the role of the desperately concerned mother with practiced urgency. "Oh, Gemma, darling, please let me help you with that," she called out, her voice carrying across the hushed ballroom. I did not break my stride. I stepped effortlessly around her outstretched hands without acknowledging her presence in any way. I walked with my head perfectly level, my posture immaculate and unbroken, carrying the dark red stain spread across my chest, not as a mark of shame or humiliation, but as a medal earned in the field. I pushed open the heavy mahogany front doors and stepped out into the sharp, cool California night. The doors closed behind me with a soft, heavy finality, cutting off the suffocating atmosphere of the gala as cleanly as a blade. I walked down the long, sweeping, illuminated driveway, the cold night wind pressing against my soaked dress, but I felt nothing except a soaring, electric, crystalline focus. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I dialed Sylvia. She answered on the first ring, her voice already sharp and fully alert. "Are you safely clear of the property?" "I am completely clear of the perimeter," I replied, my heels clicking with steady, rhythmic precision against the pavement. And they took the bait without the slightest hesitation. They are completely blinded by their own arrogance. I could hear the satisfying, rapid clatter of her keyboard through the line. "Give me the word, Gemma." I looked up at the wide, clear night sky. A deep and absolute calm settled over my mind. The particular peace that comes only when every variable has been accounted for and every contingency has been prepared. "Activate the Omega Protocol," I commanded, my voice cutting cleanly through the quiet night air. They believed they had just completed the sale of the most advanced predictive artificial intelligence algorithm in the world. They had absolutely no idea that what they had actually purchased was a beautifully constructed, completely hollow, and entirely useless interface. The sterile, temperature-controlled server room at Horizon Pharma headquarters hummed with the quiet, continuous power of a multi-million-dollar computing cluster. Donovan stood with his arms crossed firmly over his tailored jacket, his sharp eyes fixed on the massive digital displays mounted across the reinforced glass walls. This was the moment the highly publicized $2 billion acquisition was meant to transition from signed legal paperwork into a living, functioning corporate asset. The due diligence period was officially and irreversibly concluded. It was time to integrate what Brent had promised was the most advanced biological algorithm in the world into Horizon Pharma's infrastructure. Dr. Caldwell, the company's widely respected chief technology officer, was seated at the primary command console. His fingers moved across the mechanical keyboard with practiced, confident precision. A team of 6 senior software engineers stood arrayed behind him, monitoring the secure data transfer from the encrypted hard drives that Richard and Brent had personally delivered to the executive suite earlier that morning with considerable ceremony. The atmosphere in the room was dense with anticipation and quiet pride. Donovan had staked his entire professional reputation on this acquisition. He had stood before his demanding board of directors and argued with complete conviction that securing this specific genetic prediction technology would position Horizon Pharma a full decade ahead of every serious competitor in the field. He could still see Brent standing at the head of the boardroom during the final pitch, flashing that wide, effortless, charismatic smile and promising seamless integration and unparalleled data processing speeds in the same breath. "We have successfully cleared the initial security firewalls," Dr. Caldwell announced, his voice carrying a note of measured professional satisfaction. "The core interface is loading now onto our primary servers. The file architecture is extraordinarily sophisticated, genuinely impressive construction." Donovan nodded with a restrained but deeply felt satisfaction, a tight smile forming at the corners of his mouth. "Boot it up completely," he instructed. "Let us see exactly and in full detail what $2 billion secures for Horizon Pharma today." The massive display screens at the front of the laboratory flickered briefly, then came to life. A beautifully designed, sleek graphical user interface materialized in crisp, high-definition clarity. The exact same pristine dashboard Brent had showcased with such confident enthusiasm during his numerous investor presentations. The layout was elegant and deeply intuitive, presenting complex biological modeling parameters with a simplicity that belied the supposed sophistication of the underlying system. Donovan felt a profound surge of vindication moving through him. The technology was tangible, real, and it now belonged entirely and exclusively to him. "Run the first batch of oncology genomic sequences," Donovan instructed, moving closer to the glass partition that separated him from the server arrays. "Use the historical longitudinal data from our lung cancer trials. I want to see the predictive mutation timeline generated live, in real time." Dr. Caldwell gave a focused nod, his eyes fixed on his primary monitor. He imported the massive data set into the newly installed system and initiated the execution command. A sleek progress bar materialized at the center of the main display, glowing with a vibrant, promising shade of blue. The room fell into complete silence, broken only by the steady, rhythmic humming of the massive cooling fans maintaining the server racks at their required operating temperatures. Every person present held their breath, poised at the threshold of what they believed would be a historic moment in pharmaceutical technology. The progress bar reached precisely 12%. Then it stopped entirely. The vibrant blue drained instantly from the screen, replaced by a harsh, aggressive red. A sharp, discordant alarm tone detonated from the diagnostic speakers, shattering the reverent silence of the laboratory like breaking glass. Donovan's posture went rigid immediately. What just happened? Did we exceed the processing capacity of the cluster? Dr. Caldwell leaned closer to his monitor, his expression shifting from professional composure into something approaching genuine alarm. No, the computing cluster is operating at less than 5% of its total capacity. The system independently halted the execution sequence entirely. I am pulling up the back-end diagnostic logs now. The large display screen flashed violently. The elegant graphical interface vanished completely, replaced without transition by a stark black command prompt window. A single line of bold red text blinked with aggressive insistence at the center of the screen. Fatal error. Kernel access denied. Commercial license expired. Fix it, Donovan said, his voice dropping into a register that indicated he was done waiting for explanations. We hold the full proprietary rights to this software in their entirety. Override the administrative lock and restore full access. Dr. Caldwell's fingers hammered frantically across his keyboard. He opened multiple diagnostic windows simultaneously, his eyes moving rapidly across dense streams of scrolling code. The quiet confidence he had carried into the room just minutes ago had completely evaporated, replaced by something approaching controlled panic. A faint, cold perspiration was forming visibly at his hairline as he typed another override sequence, attempting to force the system into recognizing their administrative credentials. The screen flashed again. Authentication failed. Revocable license terminated by primary architect. Donovan stepped directly behind his chief technology officer, his presence filling the space with the density of an approaching storm. I do not retain you to read error messages back to me, Caldwell. I retain you to integrate acquired assets into functional infrastructure. Where is the core algorithm? Where are the predictive models? Dr. Caldwell turned slowly in his chair. Every trace of color had left his face. He looked precisely like a man who had just watched a ghost materialize through a solid concrete wall. He opened his mouth and then closed it again before speaking. Donovan, he began, his voice reduced to barely a strained whisper. The core algorithm is not on these hard drives. A silence filled the room that felt almost physical in its weight. What do you mean it is not on the drives? Donovan demanded, the words arriving in the room like individual detonations. Richard and Brent handed those drives directly to our legal team under full chain of custody. We verified and confirmed the file sizes during the initial compliance audit. The file sizes match the audit figures precisely because the drives are packed with extraordinarily dense, highly complex encrypted routing protocols, Caldwell explained slowly, his hands trembling visibly as he pointed to the scrolling data on his monitor. What they delivered to us is a masterfully constructed hollow shell. The interface we just activated is nothing more than a localized visual wrapper. It does not process any genetic data independently or internally whatsoever. He steadied himself with visible effort before continuing. Every time Brent ran a live simulation during the pitch meetings and demonstrations, the interface was silently routing an external API call to a remote, highly secured server located entirely outside this building and entirely outside our jurisdiction. The actual neural network, the artificial intelligence engine that performs all the complex biological calculations and generates the mutation predictions, exists entirely on that external server. We never purchased the machine itself, Donovan. We purchased only a temporary digital key granting conditional access to the machine. The temperature in the room seemed to fall several degrees. And the key? Donovan asked, his voice dropping to a whisper so controlled and quiet it was somehow more frightening than a shout. Dr. Caldwell looked back at the glaring red error message on the main screen for a long moment before answering. The digital key was bound to a highly specific conditional commercial licensing agreement. According to the architecture logs I am reading right now in real time, that license was permanently and manually revoked from the host server exactly 48 hours ago. The connection between our infrastructure and the actual algorithm has been completely and irreversibly severed. We have zero access, none tau, to the predictive models or the neural network beneath them. The sterile laboratory fell into a suffocating, absolute silence. The full magnitude of the deception hit Donovan with the force of something physical. Richard and Brent had stood in his immaculate boardroom, shaken his hand with apparent warmth and sincerity, and confidently accepted a $2 billion payment for a hollow piece of software that they did not legally own, did not functionally control, and had never possessed the right to sell. They had gifted Horizon Pharma an empty box, with an extraordinarily beautiful and expensive ribbon tied around it. Donovan closed his eyes for a precise, measured fraction of a second, his analytical mind rapidly and methodically calculating the cascading catastrophic fallout. The press release announcing the acquisition had already been distributed to every major financial news outlet. His board of directors had already celebrated publicly and at length. Horizon Pharma's stock price had already surged significantly on the direct and explicit promise of this technology. If the market discovered that the company had spent $2 billion on a dead, non-functional interface, the stock would collapse with devastating speed, and the board would demand his immediate and unconditional resignation. He had been comprehensively, meticulously, and catastrophically deceived by a family of arrogant, incompetent frauds. "Get my entire legal team on a secure conference line immediately," Donovan ordered, turning sharply toward the heavy laboratory doors. His voice had entirely abandoned the register of a composed corporate executive. It carried now the cold, focused determination of a man preparing to methodically and completely dismantle an empire. "Find the registered owner of that remote server. I want their identity and contact information on my desk within the hour. I want Richard and Brent physically detained in my offices before the end of this afternoon. If they cannot produce the actual source code and execute a legitimate transfer of its true ownership today, before close of business, I will personally ensure they spend the remainder of their lives in a federal penitentiary on charges of corporate fraud at a scale this industry has never witnessed." I sat across from Sylvia in her pristine, high-security office overlooking the financial district in the morning light. Sylvia slid a thick, heavy leather-bound folder with careful deliberateness across the polished mahogany desk toward me. The gold-embossed lettering on its cover caught the morning sun with quiet elegance. It read, "Nemesis Tech, Limited Liability Company." Sylvia poured 2 measured glasses of aged scotch and pushed one across the desk toward me. "A toast," she said, her sharp eyes gleaming with genuine professional satisfaction, "to the extraordinary value of absolute foresight." I lifted the glass and allowed my mind to drift back 7 years with the clarity that only complete vindication provides. I remembered sitting in the damp, windowless basement of my parents' old house, surrounded by the constant low hum of cooling fans and a landscape of empty coffee cups accumulating on every available surface. Even then, long before any valuation, long before any acquisition discussion, I knew precisely who my father was and exactly what he was ultimately capable of doing. I understood with complete certainty that Richard would eventually attempt to appropriate my life's work and deliver it to his golden child on a silver platter, simply because that was the pattern that had defined every significant decision he had made as both a father and a businessman for as long as I could remember. He had spent his entire adult life elevating Brent, injecting enormous sums of money into my brother's endless, spectacular failures, while simultaneously extracting my unpaid, unacknowledged labor as though it were simply his due. I knew without any doubt that the moment my artificial intelligence algorithm crossed the threshold into genuine profitability, they would move immediately and without hesitation to erase my name from the narrative entirely. So before I permitted my family's business to access a single solitary line of my genetic prediction code, I protected what was mine. I retained Sylvia using every dollar of my carefully accumulated personal savings. Together, in complete and deliberate secrecy, we registered the entire source code the full neural network architecture, and every layer of the predictive mutation algorithms under a heavily shielded corporate entity incorporated in Delaware. We named it Nemesis Tech. My parents' company never held legal ownership of the digital asset. Not once. Not for a single day. What they signed was a standard commercial software-as-a-service agreement, which amounted, in purely precise legal terms, to nothing more substantive than a month-to-month rental contract for technology they fundamentally misunderstood. Sylvia opened the master contract and tapped one perfectly manicured fingertip on page 42, section 4, paragraph B. She read aloud, her voice carrying the clean, ringing clarity of a courthouse verdict. The commercial license granted to the licensee is entirely contingent upon the continuous and voluntary employment of the primary architect. In the event of involuntary termination, physical removal from the premises, or hostile corporate restructuring, said license is immediately, irrevocably, and automatically terminated without further notice or recourse. I smiled, taking a slow, measured sip of the scotch. The memory of Richard signing that exact document 7 years earlier played through my mind with vivid and satisfying clarity. He had been far too arrogant, far too impatient, and frankly far too contemptuous of his quiet, compliant daughter to engage seriously with the legal documentation she placed in front of him. He had looked at the considerable stack of formal paperwork, rolled his eyes at my insistence on binding terms, scrolled his signature across the final page, and handed it back without reading a single clause. He had assumed, as he had always assumed about everything involving me, that I would never possess the strategic cunning or the cold resolve to build a defensive kill switch directly into the foundation of his empire. He was absolutely certain that he owned me. He never once considered the possibility that I owned everything he was building on top of my work. Across the city, the executive conference room at Horizon Pharma was descending rapidly and without any possibility of recovery into a state of complete, unmitigated catastrophe. Donovan hurled a heavy glass water pitcher directly against the far wall with the full force of his considerable frustration. The impact was tremendous, the thick glass detonating on contact, water spraying in a wide arc across the expensive corporate carpet. His assembled team of elite corporate attorneys sat bent over the digital contracts they had received from Richard and Brent, reviewing every line with the frantic energy of men looking for an exit that does not exist. The lead counsel, a sharp, seasoned man in a precisely fitted gray suit, pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose with a hand that was visibly, unambiguously, shaking. "Sir," the lead counsel began, his voice cracking slightly at the edges despite every effort at professional composure, holding up a printed copy of the original software licensing agreement as though it were evidence at a trial. "We have encountered a catastrophic structural problem. We did not purchase the algorithm itself. What we purchased was a corporate entity that was operating under a revocable rental agreement for the algorithm. And as of yesterday morning, that rental agreement was permanently voided and terminated by the rightful legal owner." Donovan planted both hands flat on the massive conference table with a force that sent a crack of sound through the room like a gunshot. "How is that even remotely legally possible?" he demanded, his voice at full controlled volume. "We conducted an exhaustive 6-month audit of their complete intellectual property portfolio. Brent provided us with explicit written guarantees that the family held the master copyright for all genetic software associated with this transaction. The lead counsel shuffled the papers rapidly, sweat now visible above his collar. Brent either deliberately and knowingly lied in those representations or, perhaps more accurately, he was simply too incompetent and too arrogant to comprehend the actual back-end legal and technical structure of his own family's business arrangement. The master copyright belongs entirely and exclusively to a private holding entity called Nemesis Tech. The company we just acquired was operating strictly and solely on a revocable commercial license, and the primary architect of that license triggered an absolute and irreversible kill switch that voided it permanently. The blood drained visibly and completely from Donovan's face. The devastating realization arrived with the force of something structural collapsing. Richard and Brent had stood in this very room, looked him directly and repeatedly in the eyes, and signed a multi-billion-dollar acquisition agreement for a digital asset they had zero legal standing or right to sell. This was not aggressive negotiation. This was not creative deal-making. This was federal corporate fraud of a scale and audacity that would redefine the conversation for years. "Who controls Nemesis Tech?" Donovan demanded, his voice dropping into a low, lethal register that silenced every other sound in the room. "I want the registered owner's identity confirmed immediately. We bypass Richard and Brent entirely and approach the actual owner directly. We negotiate a legitimate acquisition. We cut the fraudsters out of every conversation going forward." The lead counsel typed with urgent, concentrated speed into his secure terminal, accessing the Federal Business Registry database in real time. "The holding company is heavily and deliberately shielded," he reported, his eyes tracking rapidly across the decrypting data. "It is registered through a proxy legal firm in Delaware, but the primary architect, the sole individual with authorized administrative clearance to negotiate any licensing or acquisition agreement, is identified right here in the filings." Donovan leaned over the polished table, his jaw clenched with the force of controlled fury. "Give me the name." The lead counsel looked up slowly. His expression was a precise and deeply unsettling combination of profound shock and something approaching dread. "It is Gemma, the woman your security team physically escorted from the building yesterday afternoon. The woman Patricia described to you as suffering from a severe and active psychiatric breakdown." Donovan stood completely motionless as every piece of the architecture snapped into its correct position with brutal, crystalline clarity. Patricia had not been attempting to protect the merger from a delusional and unstable former employee. She had been engaged in a desperate, calculated race to destroy the credibility of the one person whose testimony could expose the entire deception before Horizon Pharma discovered what had actually been sold to them. The entire family had conspired with full coordination to steal a $2 billion payout, completely blind to the fact that Gemma held the only functional key to the empire they were selling. They had, in effect, sold a stolen vehicle to the most powerful pharmaceutical executive in the country. And the original owner had just remotely and permanently killed the engine. "Get my security team in this room immediately," Donovan commanded, his stride carrying him toward the heavy wooden doors with lethal and absolute purpose. "Lock down every exit in this building. Richard and Brent do not leave these premises under any circumstances. If they attempt to leave, they are to be physically detained until federal authorities are on site. They just attempted to defraud Horizon Pharma of $2 billion. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. "I am going to dismantle them completely." Back in Sylvia's office, my phone vibrated aggressively and repeatedly against the surface of the mahogany desk. I glanced down at the illuminated screen. 47 missed calls from my father, 29 from my mother, 56 increasingly frantic text messages from Brent. The raw, escalating panic was palpable through the sheer volume and desperation of the digital notifications. The false, theatrical bravado they had performed so confidently at the gala, the previous evening had evaporated entirely, replaced by the cold, dawning horror of people who have only now fully understood the magnitude of the trap they walked directly into. Sylvia swirled the amber liquid slowly in her glass, watching the phone screen illuminate again, with yet another incoming call from Richard. "They are drowning," she observed with clinical composure, a cold and entirely satisfied smile settling on her lips. I picked up the phone, considered it for a moment, and slipped it with quiet deliberateness into my coat pocket without answering a single call. "Let them sink," I said, my voice carrying precisely zero warmth, zero sympathy, and zero hesitation. They spent the entirety of our shared history treating me as a disposable, worthless asset to be used and discarded at their convenience. It is long past time they understood the actual cost of doing business with someone they so profoundly underestimated. Richard paced the full length of his massive home office in tight, agitated circuits, his expensive leather shoes pressing deep into the imported rug with each sharp turn. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the ragged, uneven sound of his own breathing and the faint, distant sounds of the estate. Patricia sat rigid and motionless on the velvet sofa, her face drained of every trace of its practiced composure. Brent stood by the window with his thumbnail pressed between his teeth, his jaw working with nervous, compulsive energy. The speakerphone on the mahogany desk had disconnected less than 10 minutes ago, but Donovan's final words were still hanging in the atmosphere of the room like a physical weight none of them could move out from under. Donovan had not shouted. He had spoken with the quiet, chilling precision of a man who has already decided on the outcome and is simply communicating the timeline. He had given them exactly 48 hours. If the artificial intelligence network was not fully operational, legally documented, and formally transferred to Horizon Pharma's control within that precise window, he would deliver every fraudulent contract and communication to the Federal Bureau of Investigation without further discussion or negotiation. He had made it entirely and unmistakably clear that he was not interested in civil damages. He intended to ensure that every member of the family served maximum federal sentences for wire fraud, intellectual property theft, and corporate deception at a scale that would set precedent. "How could you not have known?" Richard suddenly roared, spinning on his heel and slamming his fist down on the heavy wooden desk with the full force of his considerable frustration and fear. He leveled a shaking finger directly at Brent. You looked me in the eyes and told me specifically that you had conducted a thorough audit of her work. You assured me you had complete and total administrative control of the system. Brent backed away from the window instinctively, raising both hands in a reflexive defensive posture. "I did have control of the system," he argued, his voice pitching upward with a barely disguised note of panic. "I had every administrative password. The interface was running flawlessly yesterday morning when we ran the final demonstration for the Horizon board. How was I supposed to know she had a remote kill switch buried deep in the back-end architecture? I am a sales executive, not a software engineer. Nobody told me to look for a hidden kill switch in the code I cannot even read." Patricia pressed both hands hard against her temples as though trying physically to prevent the room from accelerating in its spinning. "We are going to lose everything," she whispered, the words arriving stripped of all performance and pretense. Her voice cracked under the sheer immediate weight of the terror. "The mansion, the memberships, the offshore accounts, everything. It will all disappear before the week is out. Donovan will freeze our assets before tomorrow's sunset. The government will move on this house and auction everything we have accumulated for pennies on the dollar." "We are not losing anything," Richard snapped, though the sheen of perspiration now spreading visibly across his forehead and the slight tremor in his voice betrayed precisely how hollow the declaration was. "We simply need to compel her to restore access. We call her. We offer her the position back at an improved compensation package. We frame it as a misunderstanding, a regrettable miscommunication in the heat of a complex transition. She is family. She has always responded eventually when enough pressure is properly applied. She will come around, she always has. Brent pulled his smartphone from his jacket pocket with fingers that slipped twice on the glass screen. He navigated to his sister's contact and hit the call button. The mechanical ringtone filled the silent room once, twice, 3 times. Then again. Then again. Voicemail. "Pick up the phone, Gemma," Brent said into the receiver, his voice bouncing between command and plea in a way that betrayed exactly how much control he had already lost. "This has gone far enough. You have made your point abundantly clear. Dad is prepared to negotiate terms, a reasonable severance, a promotion, whatever you need. Just call me back. Immediately." He ended the call and dialed again without pausing, sent directly to voicemail on the first ring. "She is actively ignoring every call," Brent said, staring at the phone in his hand, with the disbelief of someone who has never in his life been successfully ignored by anyone he needed something from. Patricia snatched her own phone from her designer handbag with hands that were trembling with enough force to be visible across the room, her perfectly manicured fingers shaking uncontrollably as she navigated to her daughter's number. She dialed the number with shaking fingers and pressed the phone to her ear, holding her breath with the desperate hope of a woman who had never once in her life been truly ignored by anyone she needed. "Gemma, sweetheart, it is Mom." Patricia's voice was soft, carefully calibrated to project warmth she had never once genuinely felt. "We are so incredibly worried about you. Please pick up the phone, darling. We understand completely that you are upset about how certain things were handled yesterday, but we are a family. Families argue. Families fight. But we always find our way back to forgiveness in the end. We need you to come into the office right away, sweetheart. We have a very special arrangement waiting for you that we think you will find more than satisfactory." Nothing. Complete, absolute deafening silence. Richard snatched his own phone from his jacket pocket, abandoning every last shred of paternal performance in a single movement. He left a voicemail that was stripped of everything except pure, undisguised, desperate rage. "You listen to me right now, Gemma. You are going to access that server, and you are going to restore the access keys immediately. If you do not correct this situation within the next 60 minutes, I will personally ensure you spend the remainder of your life in civil litigation, paying for the financial damages you have caused this family. Do you hear me? Call me back. Right now. Call me." The hours that followed moved with the particular, agonizing slowness that only arrives when an entire life is visibly collapsing in real time. The sun began its long descent over the sprawling estate, drawing heavy shadows across the manicured lawn like dark curtains being pulled across a stage. The luxurious, pampered existence they had constructed entirely on the foundation of my unpaid intellectual labor was crumbling before their eyes with the quiet, inevitable momentum of a controlled demolition. Brent finally hurled his phone against the wall with the full force of his frustration. The device shattered into a dozen glittering pieces across the imported marble, much like the fraudulent corporate strategy he had so confidently strutted into a boardroom to execute. "She blocked us," Brent gasped, sinking heavily onto the sofa next to our mother with the deflated posture of a man who has just been comprehensively outmaneuvered. "She blocked every single one of our numbers simultaneously. I cannot reach her through email. Her personal social media accounts have been completely deactivated. She has gone entirely dark." Patricia covered her face with both hands, a harsh, involuntary sob escaping her throat. The first genuine emotion she had produced in as long as I could remember. "She planned this," Patricia whispered, the realization arriving like cold water. "She knew precisely what we intended to do to her. She mapped our every move in advance, and she laid a trap for us. and we walked directly into it without a moment's hesitation or doubt. Richard stared blankly at the far wall, the blood having drained so completely from his face that he looked carved from old wax. For the first time in his long, arrogant, ruthless professional life, he was genuinely, utterly, and completely powerless. He had sold a $2 billion ghost to the most dangerous and methodical man in the pharmaceutical industry. He had 36 hours remaining before federal agents would arrive at his front door. "We drive to her apartment," Richard commanded, his voice trembling in a way it never had before. A slight, visible fracture in the granite that had always defined him. "We go right now, and we do not leave until she provides the access code. Whatever she demands, whatever figure she names, we agree to it without argument. We have no other available option. We are entirely and completely at her mercy." My apartment was a fortified command center of absolute digital precision. 6 curved ultra-high-definition monitors illuminated the darkened room with a steady, cascading stream of encrypted data that moved across the screens like a living organism. The low, continuous hum of my custom-built processing units filled the space with a grounding rhythm, absorbing the noise of the city streets far below into something manageable and controlled. I stood at the center of the expansive living space, breathing in the rich, dark aroma of the single-origin espresso brewing in the kitchen. Outside my reinforced windows, the San Francisco skyline glittered with the cold, indifferent brilliance of 10,000 technology companies burning their electricity into the night. Inside, I was the sole and undisputed sovereign of my own biological algorithm empire. I walked to the kitchen island and poured the steaming black coffee into my ceramic mug. The heat radiated steadily through my palms, grounding me with quiet precision in the present moment. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the bitter caffeine sharpen my already heightened analytical focus. I carried the mug back to my primary command station and settled into my ergonomic leather chair with the measured ease of someone who has already won and is simply watching the final confirmation arrive. The central monitor displayed a live, real-time feed of the authentication logs from the Nemesis tech servers. It was an absolute masterpiece of documented, measurable corporate desperation. For the past 3 hours, I had been monitoring an unrelenting cascade of failed login attempts originating from 2 sources: the executive suite at Horizon Pharma and the secure private network of my parents' sprawling estate. Richard and Brent had deployed their highly paid information technology teams to brute force their way through the outer layers of my architecture. They were directing every digital weapon in their considerable arsenal directly at my firewall. It was, analytically speaking, precisely like watching toddlers attempt to dismantle a titanium bank vault using plastic spoons. They lacked even the foundational mathematical comprehension necessary to begin to understand the cryptographic keys I had personally engineered into the system. They were entirely and permanently locked out, and the structural walls of the fraudulent empire they had constructed were closing in on them with quiet, merciless inevitability. I shifted my gaze to my smartphone resting silently on the edge of the desk. It had been completely silent since I initiated the global communication block on their numbers. The isolation was a necessary tactical decision, a deliberate withdrawal of access designed to establish total control over the pace and terms of the eventual confrontation. But the timing had now become strategically optimal to allow them a single, carefully framed glimpse over the edge of the abyss they had so enthusiastically dug for themselves. They needed to understand in specific, visceral terms the exact nature of the trap they had triggered. I picked up the device and navigated to my contact settings. With a single decisive tap, I removed the digital restriction on Brent's cellular number alone. I placed the phone back on the desk and waited with the patient calm of someone who has already completed every calculation. I knew his psychological profile with clinical precision. He was a creature of unrestrained impulse, driven entirely by ego and the lifelong absence of meaningful consequence. He had been redialing and messaging into a digital wall for hours. He would respond to the first perceived crack in my defenses immediately and without any consideration whatsoever. It took less than 40 seconds. The smartphone vibrated violently against the desk surface. The screen blazed to life with an immediate, dense barrage of incoming text messages flooding the display in rapid, breathless succession. A pure, digital manifestation of his complete and total psychological collapse. I did not reach for the device immediately. I watched the notification stack with deliberate patience, letting the pressure build. Finally, I reached out and opened the message thread. The progression of his texts was a textbook clinical study in narcissism colliding catastrophically with irreversible failure. The first message read, "Gemma, you need to turn the servers back on immediately. Dad is absolutely furious. Donovan is threatening to cancel the entire deal and pursue litigation that will obliterate us. Stop playing these childish games before you destroy everything we built together." I took another measured sip of coffee. Everything we built together. The sheer, breathtaking, self-serving audacity of those 4 words was almost genuinely entertaining in its completeness. I scrolled to the next block of escalating desperation. "Gemma, respond to me right now. We are ready to negotiate terms in good faith. Dad has authorized an immediate doubling of your severance package. He will wire you $100,000 today. Cash, directly into whatever account you designate. If you simply send the administrative credentials to my email, we can put all of this behind us as a family and move forward. You are destroying an irreplaceable legacy over a temporary petty grievance. $100,000. They were offering me an insulting, microscopic fraction of the $2 billion they had attempted to steal wholesale from my intellectual property. They still genuinely and completely believed they could purchase my permanent, silent submission with the loose change found between the cushions of their overpriced furniture. They still perceived me as the obedient, desperate girl they had kept in the basement, the one who could be redirected with a small enough treat and a firm enough tone. The final message, sent moments after I had unlocked his number, abandoned all remaining pretense of negotiation or civility. The mounting panic had fully metastasized into pure, undiluted venom, the desperate, violent thrashing of a man who has finally registered that his golden parachute is, in fact, an anvil fastened directly to his chest. "Listen to me very carefully, you ungrateful little thief. I have the most capable corporate security team in this state, actively tracing your location as I write this. You removed proprietary company data from secured premises. I am contacting the San Francisco Police Department. I am contacting federal authorities. What you have done constitutes cyber terrorism against this family and against Horizon Pharma as a corporate entity. Restore system access immediately, or I will personally ensure law enforcement kicks your front door off its hinges and removes you in handcuffs on charges of data theft and criminal sabotage. You will spend the rest of your functional life in a federal cell. This is your final warning." I read through his words twice with complete, unhurried attention, allowing the full magnitude of his delusion to register in all its richness. He genuinely and sincerely believed his hollow, fabricated threats still carried the power to make me flinch. He was operating on the assumption that the mere invocation of law enforcement would send me scrambling to comply with his demands, that 33 years of conditioned deference could be reactivated with sufficient bluster and enough capitalization. He was entirely, blissfully unaware that he was the individual currently standing beneath the most intense federal spotlight in Silicon Valley. I set my coffee mug on the desk. My hands were perfectly, completely steady. My heart rate was slow, measured, and entirely under my control. Reading his threats, I felt not 1 ounce of fear or intimidation. I felt only the absolute, settled, undeniable power of a person who possesses the complete and documented truth. I placed my fingers over the keyboard and composed my response. I did not write a lengthy explanation. I did not defend my methodology, enumerate his failures, or relitigate the accumulated injustices of our shared history. I delivered, with methodical and ruthless precision, the cold, inescapable facts of his situation. Call them. I strongly encourage it. Let us see exactly who the Federal Bureau of Investigation chooses to handcuff for attempting to sell $2 billion worth of intellectual property they never legally possessed. I pressed send. The message turned a clean, solid blue. Delivered. I set the phone on the leather sofa and turned back to the monitors. The failed login attempts continued to cascade uselessly across the authentication logs in their steady, futile rhythm. Somewhere across the city, my brother was staring at a screen, understanding for the first time and with full clarity exactly how completely he had destroyed himself. The aggressive, rhythmic pounding on my front door reverberated through the quiet, controlled atmosphere of my apartment. It was not the polite knock of a neighbor or the brief, professional tap of a courier. It was the heavy, entitled strike of a man who had spent his entire life operating on the assumption that every door in the world existed specifically to open for him. I did not move from my chair immediately. My heart rate remained perfectly steady. I shifted my gaze from the primary monitors to the high-definition security camera feed on my secondary screen. Richard stood in the hallway outside my door. He looked entirely unlike the immaculate, arrogant chief executive who had ordered armed security personnel to remove me from the building 48 hours earlier. His expensive silk tie had been yanked loose and hung crooked around his neck. His face was flushed an unhealthy, frantic crimson. He was perspiring heavily, shifting his considerable weight from one foot to the other with the contained, fraying energy of a trapped animal rapidly running out of oxygen and options. He raised his fist to strike the door again. I rose from my chair and walked to the entryway with measured, deliberate steps. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. I did not greet him warmly. I did not step aside or gesture him into my home. I stood squarely and completely in the frame, occupying the full space with calm, immovable authority. Richard pushed past me anyway, using his physical bulk to force his way into the living room with the reflexive, unexamined entitlement of someone who has never once been successfully denied entry anywhere. He stood in the center of my apartment, his eyes moving frantically across my multi-monitor setup, searching with desperate urgency for the single keyboard that might still save his disintegrating empire. He drew a long, visibly effortful breath, attempting to reassemble the commanding, invincible patriarch he had successfully performed for over 3 decades. "Let us put an end to this childish tantrum right now, Gemma," Richard said, his voice loud but hollow, aimed at filling the room in the way it always had, but lacking entirely its usual terrifying resonance. The tremor of genuine panic running beneath every word dismantled the performance before it could land. "You have made your point abundantly and dramatically. You have demonstrated that you are exceptionally clever. Now it is time to conduct yourself as a responsible adult. Set aside these petty personal grievances and protect what remains of the family business." He reached inside his wrinkled suit jacket with a hand trembling so visibly that he struggled to retrieve the leather-bound checkbook from his breast pocket. He extracted a pre-written check and slammed it down onto the surface of my kitchen island with a sharp, aggressive crack that he intended to sound authoritative and instead sounded desperate. I looked down at the paper. The handwriting was jagged and rushed, a clear physiological record of his failing composure. The figure was written in bold, unsteady strokes. $1 million. "There it is," Richard declared, drawing himself up and attempting to project an aura of sweeping, magnanimous generosity. $1 million, Gemma, tax-free, deposited directly into whatever account you designate before the close of business today. All you are required to do is sit down at that terminal, restore the commercial license for Horizon Pharma, and sign a standard non-disclosure agreement. We will formally reinstate your title as lead researcher. You take the money, you correct the technical issue you created, and we return to being a functional family. It is entirely that simple, and entirely that generous. I looked at the check for a long, unhurried moment. Then I raised my eyes to his. The audacity of his calculation was almost clinical in its completeness. You sold my intellectual property for $2 billion, I stated, my voice dropping to a register so calm and so cold it filled the room more completely than his shouting ever had. You attempted to permanently appropriate my life's work to fund a luxury existence for your son, who could not pass a freshman biology examination. And now, with federal investigators preparing their case files and Donovan's legal team actively documenting your fraud, you believe you can purchase my silence and my cooperation with exactly 0.05% of the total acquisition value. I held his gaze without any movement. You are not merely a brazen thief, Richard. You are a profoundly, structurally incompetent negotiator. Every trace of color left his face in a single, visible drain. The commanding patriarch collapsed inward instantly, leaving behind what he had always actually been beneath the performance, a frightened, aging man staring at the complete and irreversible destruction of everything he had built. He took a stumbling half-step forward, abandoning his aggressive posture entirely. He raised his trembling hands in a gesture of naked, desperate surrender. "Gemma, please," he said, his voice breaking on the single syllable of my name in a way I had never once heard in 33 years. "Please." Donovan issued a final ultimatum. He is prepared to have your mother and me remanded to federal custody by tomorrow morning. He is pursuing $500 million in punitive damages against our holding company. The bank has already begun preparing the paperwork to seize the estate. We are going to lose everything: the house, the accounts, the assets, every single thing we have spent our lives accumulating. You are my daughter. You are my flesh and blood. You cannot stand here and watch your own parents be destroyed over a business dispute. I crossed my arms and studied the man in front of me with the same analytical detachment I would bring to any other problem requiring a clear-eyed assessment. You destroyed this family the moment you decided my intelligence was simply a disposable tool to be harvested in service of Brent's lifestyle, I replied, each word arriving with complete and unhurried precision. You stood in that glass boardroom and listened without a word of objection, while your wife called me delusional in front of a room full of industry executives. You issued the order for armed guards to remove me from my own life's work, as though I were a trespasser. You weaponized the legal system to freeze my personal accounts with the explicit intention of starving me into submission. You did not think about flesh and blood yesterday morning when you were planning this. You are thinking about it today because I am the one holding the leverage. Richard's knees buckled. He sank heavily to the floor, his expensive slacks pressing into the hardwood. A man who had spent his entire life demanding that others kneel, now reduced to doing exactly that. "I will give you $5 million, he sobbed, actual tears tracking down his flushed, aging face in uneven lines. $10 million. Name the amount. I am on my knees. I am begging you, Gemma. Please. Just give me the access code and save what remains of this family." I stepped forward and picked up the $1 million check from the counter. I held it between my fingers, allowing the silence to stretch and expand, letting him inhabit the full weight of it. "For 33 years I lived in the dark so your golden child could stand in the light," I said quietly. "You told me my science had no value unless it wore a male face to the boardroom. You told me my function in this family was to silently support the legacy from the background and ask nothing in return. You demanded my obedience, my respect, and my permanent silence. I paused. But you made one catastrophic error in judgment when you chose to raise a brilliant, quiet daughter in a basement. Richard stared up at me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with the raw animal terror of a man who has finally run out of moves. I learned how to build the foundational architecture of your entire world, I continued, looking through him with complete clarity. And I learned, in precisely the same time and with precisely the same care, exactly how to dismantle it with a single keystroke. I gripped the edges of the check. With one slow, deliberate motion, I tore the thick paper directly down the center. The sound of it ripping was clean and sharp and final in the quiet apartment. I aligned the two halves and tore them again. I opened my fingers and let the pieces fall, watching them drift in small, unhurried spirals to the kitchen floor, settling beside his trembling hands like the last pages of a story that was already over. Your money has no value inside this apartment, I said. Your authority as a parent is fully and permanently void. You are currently kneeling before the Chief Executive Officer of Nemesis Tech, and I do not negotiate with corporate fraudsters under any circumstances or for any figure. Richard let out a strangled, hollow sound, something between a gasp and a groan, and buried his face in his hands. Get out of my home, I said, my voice completely even, pointing toward the hallway door with quiet finality. And I would strongly recommend contacting your defense attorneys the moment you reach your car. Donovan is not a man known for extending deadlines, and your window is closing faster than you understand. The shredded remnants of my father's check were still scattered across the kitchen floor when the security intercom buzzed for the second time that afternoon. I glanced at the surveillance feed on my far left monitor. The man standing in the lobby was not a federal agent. He was not a corporate attorney. It was Lance. He looked absolutely and completely wrecked. The immaculate posture that had always been his most carefully maintained asset had collapsed entirely. The crisp, predatory confidence he had carried when he rolled his leather suitcase across our Persian rug 48 hours ago had evaporated without a single trace. He was clutching an oversized, garish bouquet of red roses, gripping the plastic wrapping with such force that his knuckles had gone white. The sheer predictability of the gesture was almost insulting. I buzzed him up with the calm curiosity of a researcher observing a study subject perform an entirely expected behavior. I unlocked the door and stepped back, crossing my arms over my chest. Lance practically stumbled through the entryway. His designer suit was visibly rumpled, and the skin beneath his eyes carried the dark, heavy marks of a man who had not slept and had spent those sleepless hours calculating increasingly desperate scenarios. The financial district gossip network operates at extraordinary speed. Every investment firm of consequence in San Francisco already knew that the Horizon Pharma acquisition had unraveled into catastrophic, federally actionable fraud. Lance knew with absolute certainty that Brent, the man who had offered him a 7-figure CFO position 48 hours ago, was now staring directly into the barrel of federal prosecution. Gemma, Lance said, his voice fracturing on the word with carefully constructed emotional distress. He extended the roses toward me like a man offering a shield between himself and a verdict. I am so incredibly sorry. I was a complete and utter fool. I did not take the flowers. I let them hover in the space between us, suspended there by his outstretched arms, until his posture began to flag and he lowered them slowly to his side. Please, Gemma, you have to hear me out, he pressed, stepping closer, the panic radiating from him in almost measurable waves. I did not know the truth of what was actually happening. Brent manipulated me completely. He brought me into his office and presented fabricated financial projections designed specifically to deceive. He told me you were in the midst of a serious psychological breakdown and that the company needed someone with my skills to step in and protect the assets from your instability. He threatened to have me permanently blacklisted from the entire financial sector if I refused to cooperate with his transition plan. He gave me no real choice. He forced my hand. I analyzed the micro-expressions moving across his face, the slight, involuntary twitch at the outer corner of his left eye, the shallow, rapid chest breathing, the way his eyes moved fractionally upward and to the right. He was terrified, yes, but he was still actively constructing a false narrative in real time, adjusting its architecture as he spoke, testing for the weaknesses in my response. He was, as he had always fundamentally been, a creature driven entirely by capital flow. He was attempting to realign himself with the primary holder of value, which was now, unmistakably, me. I knew about Nemesis Tech, Lance continued, his fabrications growing more elaborate and more desperate with each sentence. I always knew you were the true and original genius behind the algorithm. Everything I did was part of a plan to infiltrate their inner circle and gather the evidence you would need. We are a team, Gemma. We have always been a team at our foundation. Now that you hold full and legal control of the $2 billion asset, we can build something real together. I can manage the capital. I know every investment vehicle that would maximize your returns. We can dominate this entire market together. And then, to my complete and genuine disgust, Lance lowered himself to his knees on my hardwood floor. He pressed his hands together in a theatrical gesture of contrition, looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes that had been engineered to communicate vulnerability rather than actually feel it. The man who had looked down at my clothes with contempt, the man who had called me the single biggest financial liability in Silicon Valley. The man who had rolled his suitcase across our rug without a word of genuine remorse. That man was now performing abasement at my feet. I am begging you, Gemma, he said, forcing a single tear down one cheek with the practiced precision of someone who has done this before and found it effective. Take me back. I love you. I have always loved you. I was confused and manipulated by your family's toxicity. None of what I said reflected what I truly feel. I maintained complete and unbroken silence. Explaining the precise taxonomy of his failures to a person constitutionally incapable of internalizing them would be a profound waste of finite cognitive energy. Instead, I turned away from his display without any visible reaction and walked to my desk. I picked up a thick manila envelope that my legal team had couriered to me that same morning. I carried it back to where Lance was kneeling and dropped it directly onto the floor in front of him. The heavy paper landed with a flat, definitive slap against the hardwood. Lance looked down at the envelope. The manufactured tears ceased with immediate and perfect completeness. His survival instincts engaged. He sensed, correctly, that whatever was inside represented a new and significant threat. He reached out with visibly unsteady fingers, opened the metal clasp, and withdrew the thick stack of legal documents inside. His eyes moved across the first page. The color left his face entirely. He turned to the second page, then the third, his breathing becoming audible and ragged. "What is this?" he managed, his voice barely a sound. I looked down at him with the complete freezing detachment of someone reading a standard operational outcome. "That is a formal demand for immediate payment in full," I said clearly. "When Brent promised you a brand new Porsche as a signing bonus, he required a clean credit profile to secure the vehicle's initial release from the dealership. His own credit history is destroyed by the accumulated weight of his corporate debts. When I flagged my stolen corporate card and terminated the down payment transaction, the dealership's financing division immediately defaulted to the primary guarantor listed on the vehicle lease agreement." Lance stared at the documents with the expression of a man watching the ground fall away beneath his feet. You signed the guarantor paperwork willingly and without hesitation because you believed you were stepping into a seven-figure executive role with a future, I continued. The dealership is now holding you personally liable for the full purchase price of a heavily customized luxury vehicle that you do not possess and have never driven. You currently owe them $185,000, payable immediately, to avoid formal legal action and a complete and permanent destruction of your personal credit standing. I do not have that kind of liquid capital, Lance said, the document slipping from his fingers onto the floor. I cannot cover this. If a default of that magnitude goes on my record, I will lose my portfolio manager certification. I will never work in finance again. I will be completely and permanently ruined. I stepped over the scattered papers and moved toward the front door. I placed my hand on the brass handle and pulled it open. The cool air from the hallway moved into the apartment with a quiet, clean finality. I would strongly suggest you begin liquidating your wardrobe, I said, my voice carrying precisely zero sympathy and precisely zero hesitation. And you might consider reaching out to your new professional ally, Brent, to see whether he can provide any assistance, though I understand he is currently navigating some rather significant financial complications of his own. Lance scrambled to his feet. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes cycling through terror, calculation, humiliation, and finally, the bleak, settling realization that he had played the worst professional hand of his career, and there was no appeal process available to him. He opened his mouth once, closed it. The absolute zero temperature in my expression stopped whatever remained of his argument before it could form. He collected his roses from the console table, tucked them under his arm with the deflated dignity of a man carrying the evidence of his own defeat, and walked into the hallway. His shoulders dropped inward in total, unambiguous collapse. I closed the heavy door behind him and locked the deadbolt with a single, clean, metallic click that echoed briefly in the quiet apartment. The space was finally and completely clear. Then the secondary monitor on my far right ignited with a harsh, pulsing crimson warning light. Brent was out of legal options, out of negotiating leverage, and out of time. And he had pivoted to something far more dangerous and far more irreversible. The alert was from a highly specific threat detection protocol I had written into my security infrastructure months earlier. The system was designed to silently identify and flag unauthorized, forceful penetration attempts directed at the encrypted local network of Nemesis Tech. I settled into my ergonomic chair and pulled up the primary security dashboard with measured, deliberate calm. The incoming traffic was heavy, coordinated with professional precision, and running at a level of sustained aggression that could not be automated. This was not a standard phishing script or an opportunistic probe. This was a targeted, multi-layered, sustained cyber attack, the kind that requires planning, resources, and expertise that Brent had never possessed and never would. Brent possessed the technical aptitude of someone who required assistance formatting basic spreadsheets. He could not execute a network breach of this architecture if given a year and a detailed instruction manual. That could mean only one thing. He had gone outside. He had reached into the darkest and most legally catastrophic corners of the digital market and hired professionals, promising them payment from funds he did not have and could not access. He was attempting to extract the foundational source code directly from my personal servers, a federal crime carrying a mandatory minimum sentence that would close every door to civilized society behind him permanently and without appeal. I watched the graphical representation of the attack unfold across my screens with the focused calm of someone who has already read the ending of the story. The mercenaries were deploying a sustained distributed denial-of-service attack against my external firewall, attempting to saturate my defensive monitoring protocols while simultaneously probing the routing architecture for structural vulnerabilities. It was a sophisticated and coordinated strategy, It was also entirely useless against a system I had designed from the foundational level to absorb exactly this kind of assault. My security infrastructure took the initial wave without strain. The encryption keys rotated on a randomized 4-second interval, rendering every forced entry tool in their arsenal obsolete faster than it could be redeployed. I could have closed the external connection with a single command and watched them exhaust their contract budget against an impenetrable wall. The simplest and safest resolution available to me was right there, one keystroke away. But eliminating the attack would not eliminate the threat. If I simply repelled them, Brent would regroup. He would find different contractors. He would locate more desperate individuals willing to accept his worthless promises. He would remain a constant, unpredictable variable on the periphery of everything I was building, and that was a variable I had no intention of tolerating indefinitely. I needed to neutralize him completely, permanently, and in a way that served as its own public documentation. I opened a secure, isolated sandbox environment within my internal network, a fully contained digital quarantine, completely and architecturally separated from every line of the actual core algorithm powering the genetic prediction software. Inside the vacuum, I began constructing a decoy with rapid, methodical precision. I built a sprawling directory of extraordinarily dense, structurally convincing code. To any external observer, particularly a panicked, non-technical executive operating under severe time pressure it would appear indistinguishable from the $2 billion artificial intelligence model. It carried the correct file structures. It bore the expected naming conventions. It had the precise data weight necessary to convince someone desperate that they had just recovered everything they had lost. I labeled the primary executable with the exact project designation Brent had used throughout his fraudulent investor presentations. The file contained no biological modeling of any kind. It contained something considerably more potent and considerably more permanent. I engineered a highly aggressive self-executing payload, a program designed not to simulate genetic data when opened, but to immediately and completely hijack the host network, forcibly activate every connected audio and visual peripheral in the target environment, lock all administrative controls beyond any local override, and initiate a comprehensive, uncontainable data wipe of the host server infrastructure. At the center of the payload, I embedded a specific high-definition video file programmed to broadcast continuously and, without interruption, from the moment of execution. I finished compiling the decoy package and placed it with deliberate, careful visibility in a folder positioned near the outer edge of my security perimeter. I named the folder with 6 words: Master Source Code Archive, Final Build. It was the digital equivalent of leaving a solid gold bar on an unattended park bench in a neighborhood where everyone is desperately hungry. Then I executed the most technically precise and legally significant maneuver of the entire operation. I introduced a microfracture into my own outer firewall, a carefully engineered, barely perceptible vulnerability in the external defense grid that created a narrow, poorly shielded pathway leading directly to the decoy folder and nowhere else. The gap was just wide enough to be found by professionals looking for exactly this kind of opening, and too well contained to serve as an entry point to anything of actual value. I leaned back in my chair and watched the monitors. The mercenaries found the vulnerability in under 3 minutes. The red warning indicators on my dashboard accelerated as their extraction protocols latched onto the opening with the focused, greedy urgency of professionals who believe they have just located the prize. They poured through the digital gap, bypassing every hardened sector of the network with the absolute confidence of people who think they have outmaneuvered the architect of the system they are inside. They moved directly, without hesitation, toward the glowing bait. My system flagged the initiation of a massive outbound data transfer. The progress bar advanced rapidly across the central screen. The mercenaries were downloading the entire decoy directory at full extraction speed, moving so fast, fueled by Brent's promises of payment and the time pressure of their contract window, that they did not pause for even a fraction of a second to verify the structural integrity of what they were taking. They grabbed the package and executed their retreat. I sat in the quiet blue glow of my command center and finished my coffee. The progress bar reached 100%. The external connection severed cleanly as the mercenaries withdrew into the digital dark, covering their access trails and securing what they believed was their prize. The red warning indicators on my monitors faded slowly back to a steady, even blue. The apartment was quiet. I knew with complete precision what was happening elsewhere in the city at that exact moment. The mercenaries were transferring the file to Brent. My brother was very likely sitting in his car somewhere. Expensive suit, cold sweat, laptop open on his knees, hands shaking. He would see the file name and believe, with every remaining ounce of his considerable ego, that he had just outmaneuvered me. He would believe he had saved his mansion, his reputation, and his $2 billion deal in a single audacious move. He would feel the specific rush of unearned triumph that had defined his entire life and that had, without exception, preceded every significant catastrophe he had ever suffered. He had absolutely no idea that what he was holding was a digital guillotine. He was going to carry it, with all the confidence of a man who has never once learned to doubt himself, directly into the most secured corporate boardroom in the state of California. I smiled. It was genuine. It was cold. It was the expression of someone who set the trap 3 steps ago, and has been waiting patiently ever since for the mechanism to complete its arc. The morning sun cast long, precise shadows across the apartment floor when my secondary monitor flickered to life with a quiet, definitive alert. The digital beacon I had embedded at the core of the decoy payload had successfully activated. Brent had done it. He had physically carried the infected drive through the security checkpoints and into the primary executive boardroom of Horizon Pharma. Through the compromised audio and visual peripherals of the host machine, I now had a crystal-clear, real-time view of his complete and final destruction. I leaned forward in my chair, interlaced my fingers, and watched. The high-definition feed revealed the suffocating, pressurized atmosphere of the boardroom in sharp clarity. Cold architectural lighting, expensive artwork positioned with corporate precision, and a massive mahogany table carrying the collective weight of several $100 million in ruined expectations. Donovan stood at the head of the table with the contained fury of a man who has decided exactly what is going to happen next and is waiting only for the formal confirmation to begin. My father, Richard, sat rigidly to his left, pressing a visibly damp linen handkerchief against his forehead with a trembling hand. My mother, Patricia, was gripping the strap of her designer handbag so tightly the leather had compressed between her whitened knuckles. They were all staring at the heavy glass doors with the desperation of people whose last remaining hope was about to walk through them. The doors swung open. Brent entered with the theatrical swagger of a man who has already rehearsed his victory in his mind and found it sufficiently impressive. He was wearing a new charcoal suit, almost certainly purchased on outstanding credit, and he practically radiated with the kind of arrogant, unfounded confidence that only a lifetime without real consequences can produce. He held the silver USB drive between his thumb and index finger and elevated it above the table like an Olympic torch. "I told you there was absolutely nothing to be concerned about," Brent announced, his voice carrying through my desktop speakers with clean, incriminating clarity. "The situation has been fully and permanently resolved. The problem has been neutralized, and I have personally secured the master source code archive directly from its origin point. You can stand down, Donovan. I handled the crisis." Donovan did not respond with relief. He did not nod or move toward reconciliation. His jaw was locked, a muscle working steadily in his cheek. He extended one finger toward the presentation console with the flat precision of a man who is completely out of patience. "Plug it in right now, Brent. Dr. Caldwell will run a full structural verification of the genetic algorithms immediately. If this is another delay tactic dressed as a solution, I will have federal marshals in this lobby before the end of the hour." Brent affected an expression of offended confidence. He crossed the room with deliberate, performative ease and positioned himself at the primary terminal, nudging the chief technology officer aside with his shoulder. "I will run the execution sequence personally, Donovan. I think it is important for you to see exactly why I am the vice president of this enterprise. I perform under pressure while the technical staff retreats." I watched Brent insert the silver drive into the terminal port. He navigated to the folder labeled Master Source Code Archive. He paused for precisely the fraction of a second required by ego, savoring the moment, positioning himself for the applause. And then he double-clicked the executable file I had designed with meticulous and complete care, specifically for him. "It is loading now," Brent declared, turning to face the room with the wide, triumphant grin of a man who has never once doubted his own reading of a situation. "You are about to witness the most sophisticated biological predictive model on Earth in full operation." He was technically correct on one count. They were about to witness a spectacular and definitive execution. It simply was not the one he had promised. For one long, suspended second, every display screen in the boardroom went entirely dark. Richard exhaled sharply. Patricia's grip on the table edge tightened. Donovan stepped forward, his eyes narrowing into the focused, calculating expression of someone processing incoming information at speed. Then the screens ignited in brilliant, unambiguous 4K resolution. It was not a sleek genetic modeling interface. It was raw, unedited security camera footage, presented without narration and without mercy. The video played with stark, absolute clarity, a dimly lit underground parking structure on the industrial perimeter of the city. The timestamp in the upper corner confirmed the recording had been made at exactly 3 o'clock that morning. Brent stood beside a black luxury vehicle, his body language tight with nervous energy, handing a thick leather briefcase visibly packed with banded currency to a figure in a dark hooded sweatshirt. The audio engaged through the boardroom's state-of-the-art surround sound system, filling every corner of the room with perfect fidelity. "I don't care how many firewalls she has built," Brent's voice said from the overhead speakers, clear enough to rattle the glass walls on its own. "You access my sister's personal servers tonight, and you extract that source code before morning. I am paying you to destroy her entire network from the inside. Do not leave a single recoverable trace. I want her entire digital life dismantled." The color vanished from Brent's face so completely and so immediately that the change was visible from across the room. He spun toward the screens and lunged for the keyboard, his fingers hammering at the keys with frantic, useless urgency, trying to close the video, to shut down the machine, to do anything at all to stop what was playing. Nothing responded. Every administrative function had been locked the instant the payload executed. He was, in the most complete sense, a prisoner to the premiere of his own documentary. "What in the name of God is this?" Richard screamed, his chair toppling behind him as he lurched to his feet. He jabbed a trembling finger at the screen. "Brent, you hired criminal hackers? You commissioned a cyber attack?" Before Brent could begin assembling the architecture of a defense, a second terminal window detonated open on the adjacent screen. A stark black interface populated with dense, rapidly scrolling lines of bright red code that moved too fast to read individually, but communicated emergency with absolute clarity. Dr. Caldwell shoved past Brent and placed himself in front of the console, his face transitioning through several shades of professional horror in rapid succession. "It is an aggressive, self-executing worm," Caldwell said, his voice cracking at the edges. "But it is not attacking the Horizon network. It is using our bandwidth as a tunnel. routing backward through the active connection. Tunneling backward to where? Donovan demanded, his voice arriving in the room at a frequency that made every person present go completely still. Caldwell's fingers moved across the keyboard with controlled urgency, tracing the digital trajectory through the logs. He stopped. He looked up. "It is targeting the central database," Caldwell said, "of their family business." It was completely bypassing every layer of their external security protocols because Brent had handed it direct, authenticated access without a second thought. I sat in my apartment, watching the final phase of my masterstroke execute flawlessly, line after line. The payload had never been designed to harm a single innocent bystander at Horizon Pharma. It was built for extreme, surgical precision. It hunted only for the vulnerable servers that held the entire recorded history of my family's empire. "Sir!" Caldwell yelled, lurching back from the infected machine as though it were a live, volatile bomb. "The malware is systematically executing a total, unrecoverable data wipe. It's erasing their active client records, their accounting ledgers, their payroll systems, decades of proprietary corporate communications. It is burning their entire infrastructure straight to the ground. There is absolutely nothing I can do to stop it." Patricia let out a piercing, agonizing shriek and collapsed back into her leather chair as the realization hit her all at once. Richard clutched his chest, fighting for breath, as he watched his life's work vanish into digital ash, screen by screen, line by line. Brent simply stood there, frozen, his mouth hanging open in silent, catastrophic horror. He hadn't merely driven a stolen car onto police property. He had wheeled a rigged explosive directly into the heart of his own fortress and then personally handed the detonator to his victims. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of coffee, feeling the warmth settle pleasantly in my chest. The golden child had finally received exactly what he'd paid for. The massive high-definition screens inside the Horizon Pharma boardroom abruptly cut to black. The catastrophic digital wipe of my family's corporate servers was complete. The only sound left in the cavernous executive suite was my brother's ragged, panicked hyperventilation. Brent was gripping the edge of the polished mahogany table so hard his knuckles had gone entirely white, his expensive charcoal suit soaked through with cold, terrified sweat. Donovan didn't yell this time. He didn't hurl another glass pitcher across the room. The chief executive officer of Horizon Pharma simply raised his right hand and signaled to the heavily armed private security personnel posted outside the glass walls. 2 massive guards stepped inside, taking up position directly in front of the exit. The heavy wooden doors secured themselves with a definitive metallic click. The boardroom was officially under lockdown. No one was leaving. Richard sank heavily into his executive chair, his breathing dangerously shallow. The arrogant patriarch who had ruthlessly ordered my termination days earlier was simply gone. In his place sat a man staring at his own trembling hands, fully grasping that his manufacturing empire, his offshore accounts, his client databases, and his retirement funds had just been incinerated into digital dust. He had nothing left, a completely broke, fully exposed corporate fraudster sitting at the epicenter of a $2 billion crime scene. Patricia sat frozen beside him. The emerald designer gown that had looked so commanding an hour earlier now read as a cheap costume on a tragic, aging actress. She clutched at her diamond necklace, eyes darting around the room for anyone left to manipulate. There was no sympathetic audience left to deceive. "You are all going to federal prison," Donovan said. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble carrying the full lethal weight of a corporate titan who had just been deeply, personally insulted. "I'm not just going to sue your holding company into permanent bankruptcy. I'm going to make absolutely certain the Department of Justice prosecutes each of you to the fullest extent of the law. You brought criminal hackers into my headquarters. You tried to sell me a hollow shell. You will spend what's left of your miserable lives in a concrete cell. Please. Richard's voice cracked pitifully. Donovan, listen to me. We can fix this. I'll sign over the deed to my estate. I'll liquidate every personal asset I own to compensate you for the inconvenience. We were just as blindsided by that malicious software as you were. My daughter orchestrated this entire sabotage to destroy us. She is a deeply disturbed, vindictive person. Donovan looked at my father with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. You actually think I care about your pathetic suburban real estate? He sneered coldly. You just wiped your own servers, Richard. Your company is mathematically worthless now. You have zero collateral to offer me. Before Richard could choke out another crawling plea for mercy, the electronic lock on the boardroom doors glowed green. The two massive guards stepped aside at once, their postures shifting from aggressive containment to something closer to respectful attention. The heavy mahogany doors swung wide open. I stepped over the threshold and walked directly into the center of the executive boardroom. I wasn't carrying a cardboard box of cheap desk supplies. I wasn't wearing the casual, practical clothes of a basement programmer. I was wearing a meticulously tailored midnight blue power suit that projected absolute, undeniable authority. The sharp click of my heels against the hardwood floor cut through the suffocating tension of the room like a perfectly timed metronome. Sylvia walked smoothly one step behind my right shoulder. My intellectual property attorney looked like an apex predator hunting in her natural habitat, carrying a sleek black leather briefcase that contained the complete and total destruction of everyone seated at that table. The collective reaction from my family was deeply, profoundly satisfying. Brent physically recoiled, shrinking into his chair as though he were trying to merge with the upholstery, finally recognizing the monstrous consequence of his own aggressive stupidity. Patricia let out a sharp, genuine gasp, pressing her hand to her mouth to stifle a cry. All the color drained from Richard's face. He stared at me as if he were looking at a resurrected ghost come to drag him straight down into the underworld. Donovan turned away from my shattered family and fixed his intense, calculating gaze entirely on me. His defensive posture eased slightly. He was a seasoned businessman, and he instantly recognized the dramatic shift in the room's power dynamic. The actual owner of the $2 billion asset had finally arrived at the negotiating table. "Good morning, Donovan," I said, my voice ringing with cool, perfectly measured confidence. "I apologize for the slight delay. I needed to confirm my local security protocols were executing properly before I left my apartment. I trust my brother gave you an adequate demonstration of my defensive architecture." Donovan let out a sharp, humorless bark of a laugh. "Your brother just detonated his own corporate infrastructure on my presentation screens. It was incredibly educational." I walked past my trembling parents without sparing them a single glance and moved to the opposite end of the massive mahogany table, claiming the seat of supreme authority directly across from Donovan. I unbuttoned my jacket and sat down smoothly. Sylvia took the seat to my right, setting her briefcase onto the polished table with a heavy, authoritative thud. "You cannot be here," Patricia hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of sheer panic and lingering entitlement. "You have absolutely no security clearance. Donovan, have her arrested immediately. She's the one who hacked your systems." Sylvia didn't even look at my mother. She simply popped the metal latches on her briefcase. "I'd strongly suggest you stay completely silent, Patricia," she said coldly. "You are currently an uninvited guest at a table where billionaires conduct actual business." I folded my hands on the table and looked directly into Donovan's eyes. "I'm fully aware of the fraudulent contract Richard and Brent attempted to execute yesterday," I said clearly. "They sold you a revocable commercial license that was officially terminated the instant they ordered security to remove me from the premises. They own nothing. They control nothing. They are currently facing catastrophic federal charges for corporate espionage and massive financial fraud." Donovan nodded slowly, leaning forward in his chair. And where does that leave us, Gemma? Because right now I'm holding a pile of useless legal paper and a very strong desire to ruin someone permanently. I smiled, a sharp, calculating expression that sealed their fate for good. It leaves us with an incredibly lucrative opportunity, Donovan. My family brought you a stolen, empty vehicle. I brought you the actual registered title to the engine. We're going to erase them from the equation entirely, and we're going to conduct a real transaction. Donovan steepled his fingers and leaned back in his heavy leather chair, looking at Richard the way a cold, calculating predator studies a cornered, badly wounded animal. The silence stretched across the boardroom, heavy and suffocating, before the chief executive officer finally spoke. His voice didn't echo, but it carried a terrifying weight that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen straight out of the room. "Richard," Donovan began, his tone stripped of every trace of the polite professional courtesy he'd shown during yesterday's acquisition signing. "You walked into my headquarters and presented yourself as a visionary corporate leader. You sat in my chair, drank my coffee, and smiled confidently while handing my team a digitally engineered time bomb. You assured my board that your company held the exclusive, undisputed rights to a biological algorithm you knew perfectly well belonged to someone else. You tried to sell me a stolen ghost." Horizon Pharma's lead counsel stepped forward at Donovan's silent, commanding gesture, carrying a thick stack of documents, the original acquisition agreement, signed barely 24 hours earlier. With a sharp, deliberate motion, the lawyer dropped the stack onto the center of the mahogany table. The loud, violent smack made Brent physically jump in his seat, a pathetic whimper escaping his throat. Donovan pointed a rigid finger at the stack of paper. "That agreement is completely null and void. The $2 billion acquisition of your manufacturing and development firm is officially, permanently canceled. We are halting every scheduled financial transfer immediately. Not 1 cent will ever reach your offshore accounts. Your company is mathematically dead. Your legacy is erased. You are walking out of this building with absolutely nothing." Patricia gasped loudly, gripping the edge of the table so fiercely her manicured nails looked ready to snap under the strain. "Donovan, please. You can't do this," she begged, her voice shrill and desperate. "We've already signed the transition paperwork. We made massive public announcements. The markets are already reacting to the merger. We can restructure the deal right now. We'll give you a massive discount on the price. Don't let Gemma ruin this incredible opportunity for all of us." Donovan ignored her pleading entirely, his dark eyes locked on Richard. "Canceling the acquisition is simply the first step of my response today. Richard, you committed a massive, highly coordinated fraud against a publicly traded pharmaceutical corporation. You hired criminal mercenaries to infiltrate a secure network, which then infected my presentation hardware and destroyed your own internal database in the process. You aggressively endangered my enterprise, my shareholders, and my professional reputation." He leaned forward, planting both hands flat on the table, projecting absolute dominance over the shattered family before him. "Therefore, Horizon Pharma is officially filing a civil lawsuit against you, Patricia, and Brent, personally. We are suing for $500 million in punitive damages, breach of contract, and intentional, malicious misrepresentation. We will freeze every personal asset you currently possess before the market closes today." Patricia let out a piercing, agonizing scream. It wasn't a calculated, manipulative cry meant to draw sympathy, the kind she used at her social galas. It was the raw, primal shriek of a woman watching her entire affluent reality disintegrate into ash. She stood up violently, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood. "You cannot sue us for $500 million, she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Donovan before turning the full force of her wrath on me. "This is all her fault. She set us up. She manipulated the system to make us look guilty. Arrest her right now. Sylvia, I said, calm and unhurried. My attorney's voice cut through Patricia's hysteria like a razor through silk. I'd strongly advise you to sit down and stay completely silent, Patricia. Everything you say in this room is currently being documented by the Horizon Pharma legal team. You are actively confessing to your direct involvement in a criminal conspiracy. Patricia ignored the warning, her perfectly constructed socialite facade shattering completely. She lunged toward my side of the table, face contorted with pure, unfiltered rage. "You ungrateful, malicious wretch!" she screamed at me, her voice breaking into a hoarse, ugly sob. "We gave you everything. We gave you a job when no one else would hire someone with your strange personality. We put a roof over your head. You're destroying your own family out of pure, bitter jealousy. You're ruining our entire lives." I sat perfectly still, entirely unfazed by her aggressive, desperate outburst. I didn't blink. I simply watched her unravel from a place of absolute, untouchable power. "You ruined your own lives the moment you decided my intellect was a disposable commodity you could steal and sell without my permission," I said coldly, my voice steady and completely devoid of any daughterly affection. While Patricia continued her loud, erratic meltdown, my eyes shifted down the table to my father. Richard hadn't moved an inch. He hadn't defended his screaming wife or tried to negotiate further with the furious chief executive. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch was completely paralyzed. The words, $500 million echoed endlessly in his mind, rapidly demolishing the last remaining walls of his psychological endurance. He knew his company was already destroyed by Brent's malware. He knew his reputation in Silicon Valley was permanently annihilated. And now he understood that every personal asset he owned, the sprawling estate in Atherton, the offshore portfolios, the luxury vehicles, the exclusive club memberships, would soon be seized by Donovan's legal team. He wasn't simply returning to zero. He was descending into a bottomless, suffocating pit of inescapable corporate debt. Suddenly, Richard's face lost all remaining color, turning a horrifying ashen gray. A thick sheen of cold, clammy sweat coated his forehead and neck. He let out a sharp, choked gasp, his hand flying up to clutch the center of his chest, fingers digging into the expensive fabric of his suit right over his failing heart. "Dad!" Brent yelled, his voice cracking with paralyzing terror as he finally snapped out of his own cowardly stupor. Richard tried to draw a breath, but his lungs refused to expand. His eyes widened in sheer physical agony. The crushing weight of his monumental failure, layered onto the terror of impending federal charges and financial ruin, had triggered a catastrophic physical response. He let out a low, agonizing groan as his legs gave out beneath the table, and he collapsed backward, his frame sinking deep into the leather chair, his head rolling limply to the side, his breathing dissolving into a rapid series of ragged, terrifying wheezes. Patricia's hysterical screaming stopped instantly. She turned, saw her husband slouched in the chair, clutching his chest and gasping for air, and a new, entirely different kind of panic seized her completely. She rushed to his side, trembling hands hovering uselessly over his pale, sweating face. "Richard!" she cried, her voice high and frantic. "Richard, look at me. Breathe. Somebody call an ambulance right now. He's having a heart attack." The heavy mahogany doors remained securely locked. The security guards didn't flinch or move to help the collapsing patriarch. They looked at Donovan, waiting on his orders. Donovan watched the pathetic, crumbling display of the man who had tried to swindle him out of billions, then reached calmly into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed emergency services. "Send a medical unit to the executive boardroom at Horizon Pharma," he instructed the dispatcher, his voice devoid of any human warmth. "We have a man experiencing a severe cardiac event. Tell them to hurry. He has a very important appointment with federal investigators this afternoon, and I need him breathing to face his sentencing. Donovan ended the call and set the phone face down on the table, then looked at Brent, who stood frozen beside his collapsing father, sobbing openly like a terrified, helpless child. "Your toxic family legacy is officially over," Donovan pronounced, delivering the final blow. "You have absolutely nothing left in this world." I remained seated, perfectly upright, at the opposite end of the table, watching the chaotic, life-threatening emergency unfold before me. I felt no urge whatsoever to rush to my father's side. I felt no lingering biological pull compelling me to comfort my screaming mother. The familial bond had been surgically severed the moment they ordered armed security to throw me out of my own laboratory. I simply sat beside my attorney, perfectly composed, watching the architects of my lifelong misery face the consequences of their own boundless greed. Donovan stood with a slow, terrifying grace that commanded the entire room into a kind of submission. He didn't glance back at the gasping, ashen man slumped in the chair. He didn't spare a look at the woman wailing on the floor, clutching at his trousers like a beggar. To Donovan, my parents were no longer formidable business entities, or even people worth his attention. They were simply failed variables, broken components purged from a high-stakes equation. He stepped over my mother's trembling arm with a clinical indifference more chilling than any shout. The electronic locks hissed open, and a team of paramedics rushed in with a gurney, their footsteps a frantic drumbeat against the silence. They swarmed Richard, attaching monitors and calling out medical shorthand, while Donovan merely gestured for them to move quickly and quietly, circling the long table with predatory elegance, his focus shifting entirely back to me. Patricia was forced to stand as the medics wheeled my father toward the exit. She looked at me, eyes bloodshot, filled with desperate animal hatred. She opened her mouth to spit one final insult, traitor, monster. But the words died in her throat the moment she saw Donovan's expression. He looked at her with a disgust so total it seemed to physically push her from the room. "Go with your husband, Patricia," Donovan said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "You are no longer permitted on this floor. You are no longer permitted in this industry. My security will see you to the hospital, but after that, do not ever attempt to contact Horizon Pharma or its affiliates again. You are done." The doors closed behind the gurney and my mother, leaving only the wreckage of my brother in the room. Brent still stood by the window, his suit soaked through, staring at the empty space where his father had just collapsed. He looked like a child who'd just discovered the monster under the bed was real, and that it currently wore a midnight blue power suit. Donovan stopped exactly 3 feet from me. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The suffocating weight of the last hour evaporated, replaced by a sharp, electric sense of professional possibility. He extended his hand across the table, his gaze locking onto mine with a level of respect he'd never once shown my father or brother. "Gemma," he began, his voice now carrying a rich, resonant warmth. "I've spent 20 years in this industry looking for true innovation. I've sat through thousands of pitches from men who promised me the moon and delivered nothing but dust. The moment I saw your genetic predictive models, I knew I was looking at something that would redefine the next century of medicine. My only mistake was believing, even for a second, that those two frauds were the ones who built it." I took a deep breath, smoothed the lapel of my jacket, and rose to meet him. His grip was firm, dry, certain, the handshake of an equal, a silent acknowledgement between two titans. Sylvia stood beside me, opening her briefcase and sliding a thick stack of finalized legal documents toward the center of the table. Brent took a staggering step forward, eyes wide and bloodshot, staring at the paperwork. "What are you doing?" he choked out, his voice cracking with pathetic, high-pitched desperation. "That's our company. You can't just negotiate with her. We have a signed contract, Donovan. You owe us $2 billion. Donovan didn't even turn his head toward the sobbing wreck of my brother. I've already declared your contract null and void due to catastrophic fraud and material misrepresentation, he said, with freezing finality. You sold me a product you didn't own. You committed federal crimes to secure a payout. You have zero standing in this room. Speak one more word and my guards will physically remove you and hand you to the federal marshals waiting in the lobby. Brent collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his shaking hands, a low, broken whimper escaping his lips. He was finally understanding the magnitude of his failure, watching the birth of my empire rise from the ashes of his own. Donovan turned back to me, eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. He picked up a heavy fountain pen and looked at the board members still sitting in shocked silence around the room. Gentlemen, he announced, his voice projecting with an authority that echoed off the glass walls. Today, Horizon Pharma is correcting a monumental oversight. We are not interested in acquiring a hollow shell company run by incompetent grifters. We are interested in the technology that will change the world and the brilliant architect who owns it. Therefore, I am officially announcing that Horizon Pharma has finalized a commercial merger agreement with Nemesis Tech. We are acquiring the entire intellectual property portfolio, including the master source code for the genetic predictive algorithm and all subsidiary assets. He paused, looking directly at my cowering brother before delivering the final blow. The total acquisition price for Nemesis Tech is $2.5 billion. Brent let out a strangled, agonizing gasp, as if he were being physically choked. $2.5 billion. He whispered, head snapping up to look at me in sheer, unfiltered horror. That's $500 million more than you offered us. Exactly, Donovan replied, his smile sharp and victorious. Because Gemma knows the true value of her intellect, and she knows how to protect it. She is a visionary, Brent. You're just a parasite who forgot you need a host to survive. Donovan leaned over the table and signed his name across the first page of the Nemesis Tech merger. I took the pen from his hand and added my own signature with a steady, practiced flourish. The deal was done. In a matter of minutes, the power dynamic of my entire life had been permanently and legally inverted. The daughter they'd hidden in a basement, the sister they'd mocked as an unstable failure, was now the chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar technology entity. I was no longer Gemma the data entry clerk. I was Gemma the Titan. I looked at Brent one last time. He was staring at the signed documents, mouth hanging open in catastrophic shock. Finally understanding that while he and our parents were being sued for $500 million and facing federal prison, I was walking out of that building with a fortune dwarfing anything our family had ever dreamed of possessing. They had tried to steal my future for pennies, and in doing so, they had handed me the entire world on a silver platter. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the quiet hum of the servers I now owned. I picked up my briefcase, adjusted my jacket, and looked at Donovan. Let's get to work, I said. I didn't look back as I walked out of the room, leaving the golden child to rot in the silence of his own making. Just as I secured the signed merger agreement inside my leather briefcase, the heavy mahogany doors of the executive boardroom swung open with an authoritative, violent force. The private security guard stepped aside at once, clearing a wide path for 5 individuals in sharp, dark tactical windbreakers. The bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation stamped across their backs instantly drained the remaining oxygen from the room. The lead agent, tall, imposing, with a severely sharp jawline and a gaze made of pure steel, walked directly toward the center of the shattered corporate battlefield. She didn't ask permission to enter private property. She operated with the crushing, undeniable authority of the federal government. My brother, still paralyzed in his chair, slowly turned his head. The last lingering shreds of his arrogant ego evaporated entirely, replaced by the raw, primal terror of a trapped criminal. The lead agent stopped exactly 2 feet in front of him, reached into her jacket, and pulled out a folded federal warrant. "Brent," she announced, her voice echoing off the glass walls with surgical precision. "You're under arrest for severe corporate espionage, intentional deployment of malicious commercial software, and massive federal wire fraud." Brent practically fell out of his chair, scrambling backward until his spine hit the reinforced glass partition. He raised his shaking hands, pointing a trembling, sweaty finger directly at me. "No, you have the wrong person," he shrieked, voice cracking into a pathetic whine that stripped him of any remaining dignity. "She's the one who set this up. She manipulated the external servers. I'm just a sales executive. I don't know anything about coding or malware. I was just trying to save our family's company." The federal agent didn't so much as blink at his desperate deflection. "We possess high-resolution video evidence of you conducting a direct cash transaction with known black market cybercriminals," she stated coldly. "We also hold the precise digital footprint of your personal authorization credentials actively deploying a destructive payload onto a commercial pharmaceutical network. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Brent began to hyperventilate, sobbing openly as 2 heavily armed agents closed in, grabbing his arms with practiced, unyielding force and twisting them behind his back. The crisp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists was the most beautiful, satisfying sound I'd ever experienced. The undeniable sound of absolute, inescapable justice. The golden child, the arrogant man who had mocked my cheap clothes and aggressively stolen my life's work, was being physically dragged out of corporate headquarters in front of the entire executive board. He wept like an absolute coward, begging for a father who was no longer there to bail him out of his own catastrophic consequences. The agent recited his Miranda rights as they shoved him through the heavy doors, his expensive Italian suit wrinkling horribly under the law's forceful grip. The swift, crushing hand of federal justice didn't stop at the boardroom doors. While Brent was being shoved into the back of a black government vehicle in the corporate plaza, a second unit of federal investigators had already intercepted the ambulance carrying my father. Richard had barely survived his panic-induced cardiac event, but his awakening at the hospital was far from peaceful. He opened his eyes in a sterile, brightly lit room only to find 2 federal agents standing guard at his door. They formally served him with a $500 million civil lawsuit from Horizon Pharma, running concurrently with a federal indictment for conspiracy to commit corporate fraud. The untouchable, ruthless patriarch was officially a heavily guarded prisoner, tethered to a beeping heart monitor, staring down a maximum security sentence that would outlast whatever years he had left. He stared at the ceiling, fully grasping that his boundless greed had engineered his own permanent destruction. Patricia, weeping hysterically in the hospital waiting room, received a devastating call of her own. Not from a sympathetic friend or a high society ally offering a shoulder to cry on, but from the primary lending officer at their exclusive wealth management bank. Because Donovan had aggressively frozen all their corporate and personal assets, they'd instantly defaulted on their heavily leveraged lines of credit. The bank was executing an emergency foreclosure on the sprawling Atherton estate. The lending officer forbade Patricia from returning to the property. The luxury vehicles, designer gowns, imported furniture, and priceless artwork were being seized by federal marshals to cover the damages they'd caused. She had nowhere to go. Her elite social circle abandoned her the instant the news of the corporate espionage scandal hit the local financial networks. She was a destitute, disgraced outcast standing in a public hospital lobby with nothing but the clothes on her back and a dead phone battery. I walked confidently out of Horizon Pharma's headquarters alongside Sylvia. The crisp, cool San Francisco air filled my lungs, tasting pure, completely untainted by their toxic presence. I stood on the pristine concrete steps and watched the federal vehicles flash their red and blue lights as they pulled into the busy city traffic, carrying the venomous remnants of my past away for good. I didn't feel a single ounce of pity. I didn't feel a shred of lingering familial guilt. They had meticulously dug their own graves, fueled by pure, unfiltered arrogance and a profound, fatal underestimation of my intellect. They had foolishly assumed I would quietly accept my designated role as their silent sacrificial lamb. Instead, I had methodically orchestrated their complete and utter destruction using nothing but the flawless logic of my code and the crushing, impenetrable strength of the law. The dark reign of their fraudulent, abusive empire was permanently over, eradicated from the face of the earth. The San Francisco wind whipped around me, carrying the sharp, salty scent of the Pacific. I stood at the edge of the monolithic glass and steel structure that now housed the Nemesis Tech Research Institute. 6 months had passed since the boardroom doors locked behind my shattered biological family. I rested my hands on the glass railing of my private rooftop terrace and looked down at the glittering, sprawling grid of the city below. I was exactly 33 years old, looking out at a kingdom I had built entirely with my own intellect. The contrast between this breathtaking altitude and the suffocating, windowless basement of my parents' old house was absolute. For 7 years, I had stared at a damp concrete wall, typing lines of complex biological code while they drained the company accounts to fund their lavish, fraudulent lifestyle. Tonight, I stood on top of the world, hosting an exclusive appreciation gala for the brilliant minds currently advancing global medicine using my uncompromised artificial intelligence architecture. Inside the luxurious penthouse behind me, soft jazz drifted through the air. Waiters carried silver trays of vintage champagne and artisan hors d'oeuvres to the most powerful investors, scientists, and legal minds in the biotechnology sector. They weren't here to celebrate a loud, incompetent sales executive. They were here to honor me. My phone vibrated softly inside the pocket of my tailored emerald gown. I pulled it out and glanced at the glowing screen. A text message from a completely unknown, unregistered number. I didn't recognize the area code, which usually meant a prepaid disposable phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the thread with calm, analytical curiosity. The block of text was long, riddled with desperate grammatical errors and erratic, frantic capitalization. I read it with cold, clinical detachment. Gemma, please don't ignore this message. It's your mother. I had to buy a cheap prepaid phone from a convenience store because the federal authorities confiscated all our devices and shut down our cellular plans. We have absolutely nothing left. The government seized the estate, the cars, the offshore accounts, every piece of jewelry I owned, to pay the massive restitution fines owed to Horizon Pharma. Brent was denied bail. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in a maximum security federal facility for corporate espionage. He cries every time I visit him. Your father survived the heart attack, but the hospital discharged him with a stack of medical bills we cannot possibly pay. We are currently living in a filthy weekly motel on the worst edge of Oakland. Richard needs expensive cardiac medication and intensive physical therapy just to walk to the bathroom. His heart is failing. We are starving, Gemma. I am begging you on my hands and knees. You have billions of dollars now. Please just wire us $50,000 or even $10,000, just enough to buy his medication and get us out of this horrific motel. We are your family. You cannot just leave us here to die in the gutter. Please have mercy on your own parents. I stood perfectly still on the rooftop terrace, letting the cold wind rush past my face, and read the pathetic, crawling message a second time. 6 months earlier, a message like this might have triggered a slight tremor in my hands. A lifetime of deep psychological conditioning might have forced some tiny, unearned sliver of guilt into my chest. I might have felt the oppressive, heavy chain of biological obligation trying to drag me back down into their toxic orbit. But tonight, Standing beneath the bright California stars, I felt absolutely nothing. My heart rate stayed perfectly steady. My breathing remained calm and measured. The message didn't evoke anger, sadness, or even a fleeting flicker of vindictive joy. It simply registered as an irrelevant piece of spam, a useless anomaly thrown off by a defunct system I had permanently deleted from my life. Patricia wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't apologizing for 33 years of treating my brilliant mind like a disposable commodity. She showed not a single ounce of genuine remorse for sitting in a boardroom and actively trying to have me committed to a psychiatric ward so she could steal a $2 billion fortune. She was simply a desperate, manipulative parasite searching for a new host to drain. She'd used the word mercy. The sheer, blinding audacity of that one word was the only thing that brought a genuine, peaceful smile to my lips. They had shown absolutely zero mercy when they ordered armed security to throw me onto the street with my belongings stuffed into a cardboard box. They had shown zero mercy when they froze my bank accounts and tried to starve me into permanent submission. They had ruthlessly written the rules of engagement. I had simply executed the final commands of their own destructive program. I didn't type a reply. Explaining my total indifference to a woman with zero capacity for self-reflection would have been a monumental waste of cognitive energy. I simply tapped the screen, selected the thread, and hit delete, watching the desperate, weeping text vanish entirely into the digital void. Then, with a slow, deliberate, and deeply satisfying motion, I selected the unknown number and added it to my permanent block list. The digital cord was finally, undeniably, and permanently severed. They were officially ghosts, haunting a miserable, impoverished reality of their own making. I slid the phone back into my pocket and turned away from the edge of the roof, walking toward the heavy glass doors leading back into the vibrant, brightly lit penthouse. As I crossed the threshold, the warm air of the gala washed over me. Sylvia caught my eye from across the room, my brilliant, ruthless attorney raising her crystal champagne flute in my direction with a sharp, knowing smile. She understood exactly what it took to conquer an empire. Donovan stepped away from a cluster of elite international investors and walked directly toward me, the chief executive officer of Horizon Pharma extending a glass of champagne, his expression radiating absolute professional respect. He didn't see me as a fragile daughter or a background asset. He saw me as a titan. "We just received the preliminary data from the European clinical trials," he said, his voice buzzing with genuine excitement. "Your predictive algorithms are currently outperforming our most optimistic financial projections by 40%. The board is absolutely thrilled, Gemma. You've single-handedly revolutionized the entire pharmaceutical landscape." I took the champagne glass from his hand, the cool crystal feeling perfectly solid and secure in my grip, and looked around the room. At the brilliant scientists, the aggressive legal minds, the powerful investors who had gathered specifically to celebrate my vision. This was my true family. A community built entirely on mutual respect, undeniable talent, and the honest recognition of real, tangible worth. I raised my glass, meeting Donovan's gaze with a calm, unwavering certainty. "We're just getting started, Donovan. The foundational architecture is perfectly stable now. We've successfully removed every inefficient, toxic variable from the equation. The future is completely ours to write." I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of vintage champagne. I was 33 years old. I was the sole, undisputed sovereign of a multi-billion-dollar biotechnology empire. I had survived the darkest, most abusive shadows my family could construct, and I had emerged entirely unbroken, completely untouchable, and infinitely powerful. I had finally claimed my rightful place in the sun, and I would never, under any circumstances, let anyone turn off the lights again. The story of Gemma teaches a profound and uncomfortable truth about toxic family dynamics. Blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty, respect, or love. For years, she let her family exploit her brilliant mind while they showered praise and resources on an incompetent golden child. We often accept unacceptable behavior from relatives because society conditions us to believe that family is everything. But when love is entirely conditional, based solely on what they can extract from you, it stops being love. It becomes a predatory transaction. The ultimate lesson here is the absolute necessity of self-preservation and the building of impenetrable boundaries. Gemma didn't survive her betrayal by hoping her family would suddenly develop a conscience or by begging for their approval. She survived because she knew her own intrinsic value and took concrete legal and strategic steps to protect her intellectual property long before the crisis hit. She built an undeniable safety net of facts and leverage. When you're dealing with narcissistic or exploitative people, emotional appeals will always fail. The only language they truly understand is absolute power and natural consequence. True empowerment comes from walking away from the people who desperately try to keep you in the dark. It's about recognizing that your worth is never defined by those who constantly underestimate you for their own benefit. Sometimes the most profound healing happens not through tearful reconciliation, but through a clean, permanent severance from abuse. You have the absolute right to define your own success and to build a chosen family rooted in mutual respect, genuine appreciation, and authentic connection, rather than forced biological obligation. Have you ever had to set firm boundaries to protect your worth from toxic family members? How did it change your life? Share your experience in the comments below and subscribe to our channel for more stories of resilience,